What if one of the oldest alien races in the galaxy is connected to us? The Lyrans are often described as an ancient extraterrestrial civilization from the Lyra star system, believed by some to be among the first humanoid species in the universe. Some theories suggest they didn't just exist far away in space, but may have played a role in shaping human origins and early civilizations. But where did these ideas come from, and why do the Lyrans keep appearing in alien and UFO discussions? In this video, we explore the origins, the agenda, and the hidden mysteries behind the Lyrans' alien race. There is a question that human beings have never stopped asking. It rises from the deepest part of consciousness, from somewhere beneath language and reason, from a place that seems to remember something the waking mind cannot quite grasp. The question is not simply whether we are alone in the universe. The question is older than that, and more specific, and far more unsettling. The question is, where did we come from? Not in the biological sense, not in the evolutionary sense, but in the cosmic sense, in the sense that speaks to the architecture of the soul itself. Most people who encounter this question for the first time dismiss it. They place it in the category of science fiction, or New Age fantasy, or the desperate imaginings of people who cannot accept the apparent ordinariness of human existence. But there exists, within the body of human mythology, ancient religious texts, indigenous oral traditions, modern channeled material, and the accounts of thousands of credible eyewitnesses, a consistent and remarkably coherent answer to that question. And that answer points again and again to a star system known as Lyra. The Lyra constellation is visible from Earth and has been known to human astronomers for thousands of years. It is relatively small, covering roughly 286 square degrees of the northern sky, and its brightest star, Vega, is one of the most luminous stars visible to the naked eye from Earth. At just 25 light-years away, Vega is practically a neighbor in cosmic terms. It burns about 40 times brighter than our own sun, with a surface temperature hot enough to appear a pale blue-white to observers. It is the fifth brightest star in the night sky, and it was the North Star roughly 12,000 years ago, during the era of ancient civilizations that still puzzle mainstream archaeology today. That alignment between the direction of Earth's ancient polar axis and the position of Vega is something many researchers consider more than coincidence. But we are not here to talk about astronomy alone. We are here to talk about what allegedly existed in the Lyra system long before human civilization remembered how to write. We are here to talk about a race of beings so ancient, so technologically and spiritually advanced, so deeply woven into the fabric of galactic history that their story changes everything we think we know about the origin of intelligent life, the purpose of human existence, and the hidden forces that have shaped this planet since before recorded time. The beings referred to as the Lyrans occupy a singular position in what researchers of extraterrestrial intelligence call the Galactic family tree. They are not simply one species among many. They are, according to a vast and internally consistent body of testimony, channeled information, and cross-referenced mythological record, the progenitor race, the ancestors, the original template from which a staggering variety of humanoid life in this galaxy was eventually derived. If this is true, and we will spend the next several hours examining why so many serious researchers believe it is, then understanding the Lyrans is not an exercise in speculative entertainment. It is an attempt to understand ourselves at a level that goes far deeper than the history books have ever reached. The subject of the Lyrans first began entering modern human consciousness in a systematic way during the latter half of the 20th century, though echoes of their existence can be found in texts and traditions stretching back thousands of years. The ancient Vedic scriptures of India speak of races of gods who came from the stars and interacted with early human beings, establishing civilizations and passing down knowledge that earthly humanity had not yet developed on its own. The ancient Egyptians revered Vega and recorded its position in astronomical texts that still survive today. The Dogon people of Mali, who whose cosmological knowledge of Sirius defied conventional explanation until researchers began examining it more carefully, also spoke of star peoples who had given them their understanding of the cosmos. Across every continent, in every major ancient culture, there are stories of sky beings, star ancestors, and cosmic teachers who arrived from distant points in the heavens and shaped the course of human development. These stories were dismissed for decades as the superstitious projections of pre-scientific minds. But as researchers began to look more carefully, comparing the details across cultures that had never been in contact with one another, a different picture began to emerge. The details were too specific, the descriptions too consistent, the astronomical knowledge embedded in them too accurate for the alleged level of development of the civilizations that preserved them. Something real was being remembered. Something real was being described. And as the modern UFO phenomenon exploded in the post-war era, and as contactees and abductees began reporting encounters with beings who not only looked humanoid, but who actively communicated about their origins and their relationship to humanity, the name Lyra began to surface with increasing frequency. George Van Tassel, one of the earliest and most documented contactees of the modern era, reported communications with beings who described themselves as coming from extremely ancient star civilizations that had seeded life throughout the galaxy. He did not always use the word Lyran, but the descriptions he received matched what later researchers would systematically catalog under that name. Billy Meyer, the Swiss farmer whose contact experiences became perhaps the most extensively documented in UFO research history, received explicit information from his contacts. The beings known as the Pleadians, about their own origins in the Lyra star system. The Pleiadians, according to Meyer's information, were themselves the descendants of Lyran refugees who had fled their home system after an ancient catastrophe and eventually settled in the Pleiades cluster. This was not a minor detail. This was a foundational claim about the entire trajectory of humanoid life in the galaxy. Alex Collier, a contactee who began receiving communications in the 1980s from beings he identified as Andromedans, described in extensive and consistent detail a galactic history in which the Lyrans played the central role. His accounts describe the Lyran civilization as the oldest known humanoid civilization in this galaxy, predating most other known races by hundreds of millions of years. He described their appearance, their technology, their culture, their conflicts, and their eventual diaspora across the stars in a way that was remarkably detailed, internally consistent, and strikingly similar to information coming from completely independent sources. The Andromedans, according to Collier, regarded the Lyrans with something approaching reverence, recognizing them as the rootstock from which the entire humanoid branch of galactic civilization had grown. Barbara Marciniak, whose channeling of Pleiadian entities produced several widely read books beginning in the late 1980s, also described the Lyran connection to the Pleiadians and by extension to humanity. The beings she channeled spoke of a time before time, a period in galactic history when the Lyran civilization was at its height, when the stars of Lyra were home to a people who had mastered not only physical technology, but the deeper mechanics of consciousness itself. They described the Lyrans as having a direct genetic and spiritual stake in the outcome of Earth's evolution, as beings who regarded humanity as their children, their descendants, their most cherished experiment, and their most grievous mistake. Lisa Royal, a researcher and channel whose work specifically focused on Lyran and Syrian history, produced what many consider the most organized and detailed account of Lyran origins in the modern literature. Her material, which she received in collaboration with researcher Keith Priest, and later published in works that have influenced an entire generation of extraterrestrial researchers, described the Lyran civilization in terms that went far beyond the vague spiritual generalizations that characterized much channeled material. She described specific star systems within the Lyra constellation that served as the original homeworlds. She described the biological variations within the Lyran species, which produced multiple distinct subtypes. She described the social organization of Lyran civilization, the technologies they developed, the wars they fought, and the philosophy they ultimately forged from the experience of great tragedy. What makes this body of material so compelling is not simply its consistency, though that consistency is remarkable. What makes it compelling is the way it speaks to something that humans seem to already know, somewhere beneath the level of conscious awareness. When people encounter this material for the first time, a common response is not disbelief, but recognition, a feeling of remembering rather than learning, a sense that some deep archive within the human psyche has been accessed, and the information being retrieved from it is not new but ancient, not foreign but intimate. This feeling is itself significant. If the Lyrans are indeed the progenitors of the humanoid genetic line that eventually produced Homo sapiens, then the human body itself is a living library of Lyran information. The DNA that gives us our form and function carries, according to researchers who work at the intersection of genetics and consciousness studies, layers of encoding that go far beyond what codes for proteins and cellular function. This deeper encoding, what some call junk DNA and others call latent consciousness template, may carry the memory of origins stretching back not thousands but millions of years. When that memory is activated, whether by meditation, by direct contact experience, by the resonance of certain kinds of information, the recognition people feel may be the body remembering what the mind has forgotten. This is the framework within which we will explore the Lyran story, not as a comforting mythology, not as a speculative entertainment, but as a serious and carefully assembled body of evidence pointing toward a history of this galaxy and of this planet that is infinitely older, more complex, and more meaningful than anything the standard model of human origins has yet been willing to accommodate. We will examine where the Lyrans came from before Lyra itself, tracing the deepest roots of consciousness as it took physical form in this galaxy. We will describe in detail what Lyran beings looked like, the extraordinary diversity within their species, and the biology that made them so remarkably adaptable across different planetary environments. We will explore their civilization at its height, the spiritual philosophy they developed, the technology they mastered, and the social structures they built over millions of years of continuous development. We will confront the great catastrophe that tore their civilization apart, the wars that scattered them across the stars, and the grief and wisdom that those wars ultimately produced. We will follow the diaspora, tracing how Lyran refugees and explorers seeded dozens of star systems with humanoid life, creating the Pleadians, the Syrians, the Arcturians, the Vegans, and ultimately, through a long and complex chain of intervention and experimentation, contributing essential genetic material to the creation of humanity itself. We will examine the Lyran agenda, asking with clear eyes what these beings want from Earth and from the human beings they regard as their descendants. We will look at the hidden mysteries, the technologies, and spiritual knowledge that the Lyrans possess and have, in various ways, and through various channels, attempted to transmit to humanity throughout history. We will look at the ways in which Lyran influence has been documented in modern contactee accounts, examining specific cases in detail, and drawing out the consistent themes that emerge across them. And we will look at what the Lyrans foretell about the future of humanity, the transformation they say is already underway, and the role they intend to play in it. This is not a small story. It is not a peripheral curiosity. It is, if the testimony and evidence assembled over decades of serious research is pointing toward truth, the most important story ever told. It is the story of where we came from. It is the story of what we are. And it is the story of where we are going, whether we choose to understand it or not. Let us begin at the beginning. Let us go back further than history, further than archaeology, further than the myths and legends that carry the oldest human memories. Let us go back to the origin itself, to the moment when consciousness first chose to take physical form in this part of the galaxy, and to the world that became its first true home. Before Lyra, the deepest roots. To understand the Lyrans fully, we must first understand a concept that challenges the most fundamental assumptions of conventional scientific thinking. We must understand that consciousness does not emerge from matter. Matter emerges from consciousness. This is not simply a philosophical position. It is, according to a growing body of evidence in quantum physics, in neuroscience, in the study of near-death experiences, and in the accumulated wisdom of every major spiritual tradition the human species has ever produced, the foundational truth of existence. And it is the foundational truth of the Lyran story. In the beginning, according to the cosmological framework that consistently underlies the accounts given by extraterrestrial intelligences to their human contacts, there was awareness, not awareness of anything in particular, just awareness itself. Pure, unbounded, without object or subject, without dimension or duration. This is what the Hindu tradition calls Brahman, what the Christian mystics called the Godhead, what the Buddhist teachers called sunyata, the luminous emptiness from which all form arises, what physicists working at the edge of quantum theory call the zero-point field or the quantum vacuum. Different names, different cultural frameworks, the same underlying recognition. From this primordial awareness, intention arose, not the intention of a separate being who existed before and decided to create. The intention arose within awareness itself as a spontaneous, self-organizing impulse. The way a standing wave arises in still water when conditions align. This intention was the first movement of what we might call the creative principle, the force that transforms undifferentiated potential into specific, patterned, structured existence. And from that first movement, reality as we know it began. This creative principle did not produce a single universe. It produced an effectively infinite array of universes, each defined by a particular set of physical laws, dimensional structures, and experiential possibilities. Our universe is one of these, characterized by specific constants, a specific geometry of spacetime, a specific range of possible complexity from quantum to cosmic. And within our universe, the creative impulse continued its work, producing increasingly complex patterns of organized energy that eventually gave rise to what we experience as physical matter. None of this is exactly how conventional physics describes the universe, but it is how the beings who have communicated with human contactees consistently describe it. And there is a remarkable convergence between these cosmological descriptions and certain developments in cutting-edge theoretical physics, particularly in the areas of quantum consciousness research, loop quantum gravity, and the various formulations of the anthropic principle that are forcing physicists to grapple with the apparently intentional fine-tuning of the universe's fundamental constants. The universe, it seems increasingly clear, is not the product of blind mechanical forces. It is the product of something that looks very much like mind. Within this understanding, the emergence of intelligent life is not an accident. It is not an improbable fluke that happened to occur on one small planet orbiting an unremarkable star in the outer arm of an average galaxy. It is the purpose of physical existence. It is what matter is for. It is the mechanism through which consciousness explores itself in finite form, accumulating experience and wisdom across countless lifetimes, in countless bodies on countless worlds, gradually remembering its own nature and returning enriched and transformed to its source. If this is true, and the Lyrans themselves have consistently affirmed that it is, then the emergence of the first humanoid civilization in this galaxy was not a random evolutionary event. It was the fulfillment of an intention that had been built into the structure of physical reality from the beginning. And the location where that first humanoid civilization emerged was, according to multiple independent. But we must be careful here. When we say the Lyrans were the first humanoid civilization, we do not mean they were the first form of intelligent life in the galaxy. The galaxy is approximately 13.6 billion years old, and intelligent life in non-humanoid forms, including what some sources describe as pure energy beings, crystalline consciousness entities, and what might be called plasma intelligences had existed for billions of years before the humanoid template emerged. The galactic community, if we can use that term, was already ancient and complex by the time the first beings who would eventually become the Lyrans took their first steps. According to Alex Collier's Andromedan sources, the humanoid genetic template was itself the product of an extraordinary creative project undertaken by what they call the progenitor races, extremely advanced non-humanoid beings who had existed for billions of years and who, at some point in galactic history, collaborated to design a new form of physical consciousness. This form was bipedal, bilateral, with specific brain architecture, specific emotional capacity, specific spiritual potentials built into its biology. It was designed to be a vessel for consciousness that could experience physical reality with a particular richness and depth, particularly in the dimensions of emotional experience and creative expression. The humanoid template, in other words, was created. It was engineered by beings of unimaginable wisdom and power who understood what they were doing, who had a purpose for what they were creating, and who seeded that template into the physical matrix of this galaxy through a process that took millions of years. The first world where this template took root and flourished into what we would recognize as an organized civilization is described differently by different sources, but there is general agreement that it was a world within what we now identify as the Lyra system, possibly orbiting Vega itself or one of the other stars within the constellation's boundaries. The exact stellar address is less important than the broader truth it represents, that this region of space was the cradle of humanoid consciousness in this galaxy, the place where the experiment first took hold, where the seed first germinated, where the first beings who carried the humanoid template grew from primitive awareness into sophisticated civilization. These proto-Lyrans, the very earliest ancestors of the beings we are discussing, lived in conditions quite different from those that existed later in the civilization's development. The world they inhabited was apparently a warm, lush planet with a climate somewhat warmer than Earth's, with longer days and a slightly stronger gravity. The star they orbited was similar in type to our Sun, but somewhat larger and more luminous, which meant that the planet orbited at a greater distance and experienced longer seasons. The flora and fauna of this world were extraordinarily rich, producing the kind of biodiversity that most Earth ecologists can only dream about. These early Lyrans were not yet the sophisticated, technologically advanced beings they would later become. They were, in their earliest form, hunter-gatherers with a level of technology that would have seemed primitive even by ancient human standards. But they had something extraordinary from the very beginning, an intuitive connection to consciousness itself, a natural capacity for what we might call direct knowing that gave them a relationship to reality fundamentally different from the one that currently characterizes human experience on Earth. Human beings, at this point in their development, largely experience consciousness as something that happens inside their heads. Their perception of the world is mediated by the physical senses, processed by a brain, and interpreted through the framework of a culturally conditioned ego. The result is a powerful sense of individual separation from the world and from other beings, a sense that consciousness is a private interior phenomenon contained within the physical body. The Lyrans, even in their most primitive stage, did not experience reality this way. Their individual consciousness was permeable. It blended at its edges with the consciousness of other beings, with the larger field of awareness that saturated their world, with something that can only be described as the living intelligence of the planet itself. They were individuals, yes, with distinct perspectives and personalities, but they were individuals who knew at a felt level that they were embedded in a much larger fabric of consciousness, and that this fabric was the primary reality, not the individual thread. This is perhaps the most important characteristic of the Lyran species, and it is one that has persisted through all the variations and evolutions of the humanoid line that descended from them. The capacity for this kind of expanded, permeable consciousness is built into the humanoid template itself. It is one of the design features that the progenitor races built into the original blueprint. And in the Lyrans, whose evolutionary trajectory was never interrupted or deliberately suppressed in the way that human consciousness has been, this capacity expressed itself from the very earliest stages of their development. As the millennia passed and the Lyrans developed more complex social organization, more sophisticated tools, and more elaborate understanding of the world around them, this innate connection to consciousness did not fade or diminish, as it so often does in civilizations that become preoccupied with material mastery. Instead, it deepened. The Lyrans were, from their very earliest history, both technologists and mystics. They were equally at home with the tangible mechanics of physical reality and with the deeper metaphysical principles that underlaid those mechanics. Their science and their spirituality were never in conflict. because they had never developed the kind of dualistic thinking that separates the material from the spiritual, the measurable from the sacred, the empirically verifiable from the intuitively known. This integration of science and spirit produced a civilization of extraordinary depth and sophistication, but it also produced, inevitably, the tensions and conflicts that come when beings of great power grapple with questions of purpose, identity, and the proper use of their capabilities. The Lyrans were not angels. They were not perfect beings operating in a state of perpetual harmony and wisdom. They were consciousness in physical form, learning through experience, making mistakes, achieving insights, losing them again, and gradually, painfully, with enormous cost, developing the wisdom that would eventually transform them into the beings they became. The early history of Lyran civilization, stretching across what researchers estimate to be several million years, is a story of extraordinary achievement punctuated by periods of serious conflict and even near catastrophe. There were wars within the Lyran civilization itself, particularly as different groups developed divergent philosophical and spiritual orientations and came into conflict over the direction their society should take. There were internal debates of extraordinary depth and passion about the nature of consciousness, the purpose of physical existence, the rights and responsibilities of a technologically advanced civilization, and the proper relationship between different types of beings. These debates were not merely academic. They played out in the physical world with real consequences. Factions formed, alliances shifted, technologies developed in the service of conflict as readily as in the service of healing and creation. The Lyrans, in other words, went through something very much like what humanity is going through now, a period of rapid technological development that outpaced their moral and spiritual development, a period of power without sufficient wisdom, of capability without adequate compassion, and they suffered the consequences of that imbalance, as all civilizations must who walk that particular path. What is remarkable, and what gives the Lyran story its particular relevance to the current human moment, is that they came through it. They did not destroy themselves, though they came close. They did not collapse into barbarism, though they touched it. They emerged from those difficult periods of their history with a depth of understanding that could only have been won through genuine suffering and genuine reflection, a wisdom forged in the fire of their own failures and paid for with blood and tears that are, if the stories are true, ancestral to the blood and tears of every human being alive today. Understanding where the Lyrans came from, not just their physical planet of origin, but the deeper origin in consciousness that produced them, is essential to understanding everything that follows. Because the Lyrans are not simply an alien species that happens to have an interesting history. They are, according to the framework we are exploring, the elder version of what humanity is in the process of becoming, the mirror in which we can see both our own deep past and our potential future. The proof, if proof is what we need, that consciousness can travel the distance from ignorance to wisdom, from conflict to coherence, from separation to reunion, and that the journey, however long and painful it may be, is worth taking. The physical world where the Lyran civilization first developed is described in detail by several sources, and those descriptions are consistent enough across independent accounts to suggest they are drawing from the same underlying reality. The planet itself was larger than Earth, with a diameter roughly 1.3 times our own and a mass approximately 1.7 times greater. This produced a surface gravity somewhat stronger than what human beings experience, which contributed to the physical robustness that would characterize the Lyran body type throughout most of its history. The planet's axial tilt was moderate, producing seasons, but the overall climate was warmer and more uniform than Earth's, with large shallow seas covering perhaps 65% of the surface and vast expanses of lush vegetation covering most of the land. The star system itself was ancient by the time the Lyran civilization emerged, having formed in the early periods of galactic history when the abundance of heavy elements necessary for complex chemistry was becoming more widely available in the interstellar medium. This age gave the system a stability and a richness that supported the long evolutionary development of complex life, and eventually of the beings who would become the founding ancestors of an entire galactic civilization. The early Lyrans developed their first cities along the shores of the Great Shallow Seas, in climates warm enough to support year-round agriculture and mild enough to encourage the kind of communal social gathering that accelerates cultural development. Their architecture, even in its earliest expressions, showed the integrative aesthetic that would characterize all later Lyran design. Structures that worked with natural forms rather than against them, that used materials in harmony with their environment, that expressed through their physical form the spiritual understanding of the people who built them. Even the earliest Lyran settlements were beautiful in a way that reflected their builders' innate sense of the sacred in the material. As we trace the development of Lyran civilization through its earliest phases, we see a pattern that is both alien and deeply familiar. The familiar part is the basic trajectory, from hunter-gatherers to farmers, from farmers to city dwellers, from city dwellers to the complex, stratified, intellectually rich society that eventually produced the technological breakthroughs that would carry the Lyrans to the stars. The alien part is the quality of consciousness that infused every stage of that development, the constant presence of that direct knowing, that permeable awareness, that refusal to separate the material from the sacred, which gave Lyran civilization its distinctive character. This quality did not prevent conflict. As we have said, the Lyrans experienced serious internal conflicts throughout their early history, but it did mean that even in their conflicts, there were always those among them who maintained the larger view, who could see beyond the immediate passions of the moment to the deeper patterns and deeper consequences, and who worked tirelessly to bring understanding where misunderstanding had taken root. These individuals, the Lyran wisdom keepers, the teachers, the healers, the philosophers, played a role in their civilization that is perhaps analogous to what various spiritual traditions have attempted on Earth: the effort to maintain connection to a deeper truth in the face of the powerful distractions of power, fear, and desire. It is from this dual nature of the Lyran civilization, its extraordinary spiritual depth coexisting with very real capacity for conflict and error, that the complexity of their legacy derives. They are not the simple benevolent space brothers of early UFO mythology. They are not the malevolent controllers of darker conspiracy narratives. They are something far more interesting, far more instructive, and far more real than either of those simplified versions. They are a people who walked the full path of conscious evolution in physical form, who paid the full price of that journey, and who emerged from it carrying a wisdom that they have been trying in various ways and with varying degrees of success to pass along to their children ever since. And we are, if the evidence is to be believed, their children. Who are the Lyrans? Physical description and biological diversity. One of the most striking aspects of the Lyran material, the body of testimony and channeled information that describes these beings in detail, is the extraordinary diversity of physical form that falls under the Lyran designation. Unlike the stereotyped gray alien of popular culture, which is a single, uniform physical type instantly recognizable from 1,000 science fiction films and tabloid covers, the Lyrans present a bewildering variety of physical appearances that seems, at first glance, almost paradoxical. How can beings with such radically different physical forms all belong to a single species or civilization? The answer to that question requires us to update our understanding of what a species is and how diversity within a long-established civilization actually works. The Lyran civilization, at its height, spanned multiple star systems and had been developing continuously for millions of years. Over that timescale, the kind of biological diversification that produces distinct varieties within a species is not just possible, but inevitable. Human beings themselves show enormous genetic diversity after only a few 100,000 years of development, and most of that diversity is cosmetically superficial, the result of adaptation to different regional environments. The Lyran diversity is much deeper, reflecting millions of years of development on worlds with significantly different environmental conditions, different gravities, different stellar spectra, different atmospheric compositions. Within the broad category of Lyran beings, researchers have identified several primary subtypes, each with distinct physical characteristics, but sharing the underlying template that identifies them as part of the Lyran humanoid lineage. The most commonly described Lyran type, and the one that appears most frequently in the accounts of contactees and channeled sources, is what researchers have come to call the Caucasian Lyran, or the Nordic Lyran. This designation, while imperfect, captures something essential about the appearance of these beings. They are tall, averaging between 6 and 7 feet in height, though individuals of 8 feet have been reported in some accounts. Their build is athletic and robust, with a musculature that reflects the slightly higher gravity of their homeworld, dense without being heavy, capable without being exaggerated. Their skin tones range from a very pale, almost luminous white through various shades of cream and golden tan, with some accounts describing a faint iridescence in certain lighting conditions, as though the skin contained a subtle inner light. Their facial structure is recognizably humanoid but distinctly different from any human ethnic type, combining features in a way that many contactees describe as breathtakingly beautiful by any standard they could apply. The bone structure is fine but clearly defined, with high cheekbones, a broad forehead, and a jaw that is strong without being heavy. The nose is straight and well-formed. The lips are full. The overall impression is one of great strength combined with great refinement, as though the physical form has been optimized over millions of years of evolution to express both power and grace simultaneously. Their eyes are perhaps the most frequently noted feature in contactee descriptions. Lyran eyes are large by human standards, with an iris that covers a significantly greater proportion of the visible eye surface than human irises do, giving them an appearance that many contactees describe as luminous, deep, or impossibly compelling. The range of eye colors reported is extraordinary: deep violet, electric blue, gold, amber, green of a shade that has no equivalent in the human color vocabulary, and silver, a true metallic silver that does not appear naturally in any human eye. The pupil is vertical, like a cat's in some accounts, or fully round but larger than human proportion in others. The sclera, the white of the eye, is sometimes described as white, but with a very faint bluish or golden cast. Their hair ranges from a brilliant platinum white through various shades of gold and honey blonde, with some accounts describing individuals with hair of a copper-red color. The hair is typically long, often worn loose, and has a quality that contactees struggle to describe adequately, a luminosity or vibrancy that seems to exceed what hair normally looks like, as though each strand carries a subtle light of its own. The texture is described as very fine and soft. Most accounts agree that the Nordic Lyrans do not have significant body hair beyond what appears on the head and the eyebrows, which are typically lighter in color than human eyebrows and very fine in texture. The overall impression is of a being who is simultaneously more physically perfect and more ethereally refined than any human being the contactee has ever seen, as though they represent an idealized version of the human form, the template expressed without the accumulated compromises of a difficult evolutionary history. The second major Lyran subtype is significantly different in appearance and represents perhaps the most surprising element of the Lyran biological family. These are the beings that researchers call the Lyran bird people, or, more technically, the avian Lyrans. Do not let the name mislead you. These are not beings who look like birds in any simplistic sense. They are fully humanoid in their basic structure, bipedal, bilateral, with the same general proportions as other humanoid beings, but they carry in their physical form unmistakable characteristics of avian biology that give them a strikingly distinctive appearance. Their faces are more angular than those of the Nordic Lyrans, with higher, more prominent cheekbones, and a nose that, while not a beak, has a sharper, more aquiline quality. Their eyes are set somewhat further apart, and are slightly larger relative to their face, with an iris that tends toward gold, amber, or a deep reddish orange. Their skin has a fine, slightly textured quality that some contactees describe as reminiscent of very fine scales or very small feathers, though most agree that it reads as skin, not as actual feathers or scales. Their coloring tends toward earth tones, warm golds, rich browns, deep tawny oranges, and occasionally a striking pale cream that contrasts dramatically with their more vivid eye coloring. The most distinctively avian feature of these beings is something that contactees consistently struggle to describe but consistently report: a quality of presence that is simultaneously intensely focused and panoramically aware, as though they can track an entire environment with a kind of perception that encompasses more than human vision or hearing allows. Some contactees describe this as feeling watched in the most profound possible sense, not in a threatening way, but in the way that a master artist watches a landscape before painting it, with complete and loving attention to every detail simultaneously. The avian Lyrans are described as somewhat shorter than the Nordic Lyrans, averaging between 5.5 and 6.5 feet, with a more lithe, agile build. Their movements are reported as extraordinarily graceful and precise, with a quality of controlled economy that wastes no motion and misses no opportunity. They are described by those who have encountered them as the most mentally formidable of the Lyran varieties, with a quality of intelligence that feels architecturally precise, like a mind that has been built for the analysis of complex systems. The third major Lyran subtype is perhaps the most mysterious and the least frequently encountered in modern contactee accounts. These are the beings referred to as the Lyran feline people, or the leonine Lyrans. Like the avian Lyrans, these beings are not literally feline. They do not have tails or pointed ears in most accounts, though occasional reports mention both. What they have is a facial structure, a quality of movement, and an energetic presence that consistently evokes the impression of feline consciousness translated into humanoid form. Their faces are broader than those of either of the other Lyran types, with wide-set eyes, a broader nose, and a jaw structure that is more pronounced and powerful. Their skin tends toward golden tones, sometimes with an extraordinarily fine textural pattern that in certain lighting conditions resembles the ghost of a leopard's spots, though most contactees are careful to note that this is a suggestion rather than an explicit pattern. Their hair, when present, tends to be thick and full, more like a mane than the fine luminous hair of the Nordic types, and often ranges from deep gold through warm brown to a rich auburn. The leonine Lyrans are the largest of the three primary subtypes, with some accounts placing their average height at well over 7 feet, with a corresponding musculature that is both more massive and more explicitly powerful than the other Lyran varieties. Despite this physical impressiveness, they are consistently described as extraordinarily gentle in their interactions with humans, as though their great physical power is held in such perfect conscious control that it never intrudes unless deliberately offered. The quality of presence they project is, in the words of one contactee, like standing in a sunlit clearing with a great lion lying 20 feet away, utterly at ease, utterly unthreatening, and yet radiating an awareness of its own power that changes the quality of the air around it. These three primary subtypes, the Nordic, the avian, and the leonine, represent the major biological variations within what we are calling the Lyran family, but researchers are quick to point out that these are categories of convenience, not rigid boundaries. Over millions of years of development, interbreeding between the subtypes produced a vast range of intermediate forms, and environmental adaptation on different worlds produced additional variations that do not fit neatly into any of the three primary categories. The Lyran biological family is best understood as a spectrum, with the three primary types as anchor points within that spectrum, rather than as discrete and mutually exclusive categories. There are also a number of unusual characteristics that appear across all Lyran subtypes, regardless of which primary type they most closely resemble, and these shared characteristics are among the most significant indicators of the common origin that underlies the apparent diversity. The first and most important of these shared characteristics is what might be called biological luminosity. Across all accounts of Lyran beings, regardless of which subtype is being described, contactees consistently report an impression that these beings emit a subtle light. This is not the dramatic glow of science fiction special effects. It is something much more subtle, a quality of the skin, the eyes, and the overall energetic field of the being that suggests an inner light source operating at the threshold of human visual perception. Some contactees attribute this to the aura, the energetic field that surrounds all living beings, being simply much more visible in Lyran beings than in humans. Others describe it as a physical quality of the skin itself, as though the cells have a greater bioluminescent capacity than human cells do. This biological luminosity is consistent with what various sources describe as a fundamental difference between Lyran biology and human biology at the cellular level. Lyran cells, according to these accounts, operate at a higher energetic frequency than human cells, processing and radiating more energy per unit of biological activity. This higher cellular frequency is related to what we might call the efficiency of their connection to consciousness, the degree to which the physical body serves as a transparent vessel for conscious awareness, rather than an opaque container that filters and limits it. The more fully a physical body is aligned with the consciousness it houses, the more energetically coherent its cellular activity becomes, and coherent energy produces coherent light. The second shared characteristic across Lyran subtypes is their extraordinary longevity. Physical Lyran beings, operating in their home star systems under normal conditions, are described as living for thousands of years. Some accounts suggest that the average Lyran lifespan in their optimal environment exceeds 5,000 years in what we would measure as Earth years. This extraordinary longevity is not the result of medical intervention, at least not in their more advanced phases, but of the fundamental biological efficiency of their cellular systems, combined with what might be called their mastery of the regenerative potential within living tissue. Human beings have, built into their DNA, the theoretical capacity to regenerate their cells in ways that would prevent most of the aging processes that currently limit our lifespan. The telomere research of recent decades has begun to illuminate the biological mechanisms by which aging proceeds and the ways in which those mechanisms might be altered or reversed. Lyran biology, according to the framework we are exploring, represents a natural expression of the regenerative potential that human biology carries in a suppressed or dormant form. This is not coincidental. It reflects the common template from which both Lyran and human biology derive. The third shared characteristic is sensory capacity that significantly exceeds that of baseline human beings. This is not simply a matter of sharper vision or more sensitive hearing, though Lyran's sensory acuity in the physical frequencies is substantially greater than human. More significant is what might be called the extrasensory dimension of Lyran perception. Lyran beings are described, across all accounts, as having natural and fully developed capacities for telepathy, empathy, precognition, remote viewing, and what various traditions call clairsentience, the ability to directly sense the energetic and emotional states of other beings and environments without physical proximity. These capacities are not supernatural in the Lyran context. They are as natural and as normally functioning as sight or hearing in a human being. Every Lyran being, regardless of their individual level of development or their particular subtype, uses these perceptual capacities constantly as the primary means of navigating the social and environmental reality around them. The result is a form of social life and a quality of interpersonal relationship that is so different from anything in human experience that contactees consistently struggle to find adequate analogies for it. Imagine a social environment in which every being you interact with knows immediately what you are feeling, can perceive your intentions with clarity, can sense the truthfulness or deception in your communications, and can feel the resonance or dissonance between their own energy and yours. Imagine that this perception is mutual and that everyone involved in any social interaction is operating within this fully transparent field. The implications for social organization, for politics, for what we might call cultural ethics, are profound. Deception becomes nearly impossible. Manipulation becomes nearly impossible. The kind of hidden agenda setting that drives much of human political and social life becomes nearly impossible because the hidden agendas are immediately perceptible to everyone in the field. This does not mean that Lyran society was conflict-free. We have already established that it was not. Conflicts of perspective and priority are inevitable wherever beings with distinct viewpoints interact, regardless of how transparent those viewpoints are to one another. But it does mean that Lyran conflicts were qualitatively different from human conflicts. They could not be driven by the kinds of misunderstanding, manipulation, and deliberate deception that fuel so many human conflicts. They were genuine disagreements between beings who understood each other clearly and still could not find alignment, which means that when resolution was found, it was genuine resolution, real understanding rather than temporary suppression. And when it was not found, the conflict was at least honest, driven by real incompatibility rather than manufactured division. The fourth shared characteristic is perhaps the most difficult to describe within the framework of human language and human conceptual categories, and yet it may be the most important. It is what various sources describe as quantum consciousness, the ability to operate simultaneously at multiple levels of awareness, experiencing the physical dimension of reality, while simultaneously maintaining connection to the non-physical dimensions from which physical reality emerges. Human beings, in their current state of development, primarily experience consciousness as a single stream, a sequential, linear awareness that moves through time from past to present to future, experiencing one thing at a time, perceiving the physical world as the primary and often exclusive reality. Lyran consciousness, in its natural state, is not like this. It is more like a symphony than a single melody. Multiple streams of awareness operating simultaneously on different levels, the physical and the non-physical, the personal and the transpersonal, the local and the cosmic, all active at once and contributing their information to an integrated field of knowing that exceeds what any single stream could produce alone. This multi-level consciousness is not some exotic spiritual achievement for the Lyrans. It is their baseline. It is what Lyran children grow into naturally, without special training, as their neurological and energetic systems mature. It is the natural expression of the humanoid template operating without the suppression and interference that has characterized human development. And it is, according to the sources we are drawing on, the direction in which human consciousness is currently evolving, the destination toward which the current period of accelerated human awakening is pointing. When we understand this about the Lyrans, when we understand the nature of their consciousness, their longevity, their perceptual capacities, and their biological luminosity, the stories about them take on a different quality. They are no longer simply stories about physically impressive aliens with advanced technology. They are stories about what consciousness looks like when it is allowed to fully inhabit a physical form, when the physical body becomes what it was always designed to be, a perfect instrument of cosmic awareness, a vehicle through which the totality of existence is experienced from a unique and irreplaceable perspective. The Lyrans achieve this not through some miraculous shortcut or divine dispensation, but through millions of years of development, through suffering and error and learning and recovery, through all the difficult, messy, costly process that consciousness in physical form must undergo when it is seriously committed to growing. They are our elder siblings in this process. They have walked the path that we are walking now, further and longer than we have, and they carry with them a map drawn from direct experience of every terrain we have yet to cross. This is why their story matters, not because they are powerful and we are weak, though they are more powerful in many ways and we are in many ways weak, not because they are wise and we are foolish, though their wisdom exceeds ours in domains we are only beginning to recognize. Their story matters because it is our story. It is the story that our story is part of. It is the chapter that comes before the chapter we are currently writing, and without it, what we are experiencing now makes very little sense. In the next part of our exploration, we will look at the civilization these beings built at their height, the technologies they developed, the social structures they created, the philosophy that guided them, and the arts and sciences they practiced. We will look at what a Lyran world looked like when the civilization was at its peak, before the catastrophe that changed everything. And we will look at the elements of that civilization that, according to many sources, were deliberately preserved and eventually transmitted to humanity as part of the long program of reconnection that the Lyrans have been conducting with their children on Earth throughout recorded history. The Lyran civilization at its height. To speak of the Lyran civilization at its height is to attempt something that language was not designed for. It is to describe a state of collective human, or rather humanoid, development so far beyond anything that currently exists on Earth that every analogy falls short, every comparison limps, every reference point available in the human vocabulary understates the reality being pointed toward. And yet the attempt must be made. because without some understanding of what the Lyrans built at their greatest, we cannot understand the magnitude of what they lost, the desperation of the diaspora that followed, or the depth of the obligation they feel toward the descendants they left behind on worlds across the galaxy. Let us begin with the technology, because it is the aspect most readily imaginable within a human framework, even if the specific expressions of that technology go far beyond what current Earth science has yet achieved. Lyran technology, at its height, was unified. This is the first and most important thing to understand about it. It did not separate the physical from the energetic, the mechanical from the biological, the material from the conscious. It was a technology in which all of these domains were fully integrated, in which the tools and structures that the Lyrans created were as alive, in the meaningful sense of the word, as the beings who created them. Consider what this means for something as apparently simple as architecture. Human buildings are, with very few exceptions, dead structures. They are assemblages of materials arranged according to engineering principles into forms that serve functional purposes. They do not interact with the consciousness of the people who inhabit them. They do not respond to emotional or energetic states. They do not participate in the life processes of their occupants. They are essentially elaborate containers. Lyran buildings were nothing like this. They were designed using principles drawn from a deep understanding of the relationship between geometric form, energetic resonance, and conscious experience. The materials used in their construction were not simply processed raw materials, but substances that had been worked with at an energetic level, their natural crystalline structures aligned and enhanced to maximize their resonant properties. The resulting buildings were structures that actively supported the consciousness of their inhabitants, that amplified coherent emotional states, that provided a kind of continuous energetic nourishment to everyone within them, much as a healthy forest environment nourishes the physical body with clean air and negative ions, but at the level of consciousness and energy rather than simply biochemistry. This was not mystical or supernatural. It was the application of a science of consciousness that went far beyond anything that currently exists in the mainstream of human scientific knowledge, but which is pointed toward by various threads of cutting-edge research in areas like sacred geometry, acoustic resonance, cymatics, the effects of various electromagnetic frequencies on human consciousness, and the emerging field of consciousness studies. The Lyrans understood, at a level of precision that allowed them to engineer the results, exactly how geometry, frequency, proportion, and material composition interact with conscious awareness, and they built that understanding into every structure they created, from the simplest dwelling to the most elaborate civic architecture. Their transportation technology was equally sophisticated and equally integrated with their understanding of consciousness. By the time the Lyran civilization reached its height, physical transportation within their home system had been largely superseded by what we might call consciousness-based transit, the ability to relocate the physical body through a direct interaction of focused intention with the underlying field of quantum potentiality. This is what various human traditions have described under terms like teleportation, bilocation, or instantaneous travel, and what certain advanced meditators and mystics on Earth have reportedly demonstrated in limited form. The Lyrans had developed this capacity to a level where it was a reliable, everyday technology rather than a rare mystical achievement. Their understanding of the relationship between physical matter and consciousness was sophisticated enough that they had mapped the mechanisms by which intention interacts with the probabilistic nature of physical location at the quantum level, and they had developed practices and technologies that amplified and stabilized this interaction to the point where reliable teleportation was possible for any Lyran being who had undergone the appropriate training. For interstellar travel, a different set of technologies applied. The distances between star systems, even within the relatively compact region of the galaxy that the Lyrans inhabited, are too vast for teleportation alone to be practical without an extraordinary degree of energetic development. For interstellar distances, the Lyrans developed what various sources describe as dimensional transit technology, a means of accessing the non-physical dimensional structure of space to travel between distant points without traversing the physical distance between them. This is not faster than light travel in the conventional science fiction sense. It is rather the recognition that the apparent distances of physical space are a feature of one particular dimensional layer of reality, and that by accessing other dimensional layers, those apparent distances become irrelevant. The physics underlying this technology are not fully accessible within the framework of current human scientific understanding, though theoretical physicists working in areas like string theory and brain cosmology are beginning to develop mathematical frameworks that point in the relevant direction. What the Lyrans understood and what their technology embodied was that physical space is not the fundamental level of reality. It is a pattern within a deeper reality, and that deeper reality has a geometry that allows what appear to be vast distances in physical space to be bridged through what might be described as shortcuts through the underlying dimensional structure. Their medical technology was perhaps the most wondrous of all. Viewed from a human perspective, the Lyrans had developed a comprehensive understanding of the relationship between consciousness and physical health that went far beyond the biochemical model that currently dominates human medicine. They understood that physical illness is always, at its root, a manifestation of a disruption in the energetic and conscious template that underlies physical form. They understood that the physical body has an inherent intelligence, a self-correcting, self-regenerating capacity that operates continuously at levels far below conscious awareness, and that this capacity is sufficient to heal virtually any physical condition if it is properly supported, and if the deeper energetic disruptions that triggered the physical manifestation are addressed. Their medical practice consequently operated primarily at the energetic and conscious level, using frequencies, geometric forms, light, sound, and direct consciousness-to-consciousness interaction to restore the energetic template to coherence, allowing the body's own regenerative intelligence to do the rest. Physical interventions of the kind that dominate human medicine were used only when more direct energetic approaches were insufficient or when immediate physical support was needed, while deeper healing was facilitated. The results were, by human medical standards, extraordinary. Conditions that would be considered incurable by current Earth medicine were routinely resolved in Lyran healing practice, and the lifespan that resulted from this combination of inherently efficient biology and sophisticated energetic medical support gave the Lyrans not just thousands of years of life, but thousands of years of physically vibrant, mentally acute, emotionally rich life, not the long deterioration that characterizes human aging, but a sustained flowering of capability that continued right up to the natural conclusion of a physical cycle. The social organization of the Lyran civilization at its height was as sophisticated and as alien to human experience as their technology. In their most developed phase, the Lyrans had moved through and beyond what we would recognize as organized government in the conventional sense. They had no president, no council of elders with binding authority, no legislative body that made rules by majority vote. They had, instead, a system of social organization that researchers struggle to name adequately, though terms like emergent consensus, organic governance, or conscious democracy come closest. The system worked because of the telepathic and empathic transparency that characterized Lyran's social life. In a society where every member has full access to the emotional and intentional states of every other member, the kind of power concentration that makes hierarchical political systems necessary simply cannot occur. Anyone who attempted to accumulate disproportionate power, to manipulate others for personal advantage, to deceive or mislead the community for selfish ends, would be immediately and transparently visible to everyone around them. The social immune system, if we can call it that, would respond instantly and effectively, not through punishment or force, but through the kind of clear, compassionate, unignorable social reflection that comes from a community of beings who cannot look away from what they perceive. The result was a form of social self-organization that operated through genuine consensus, not the laborious and often failed consensus processes that human communities sometimes attempt, but a truly organic emergence of collective decision from the full participation of all members of the community in a shared field of awareness. When every member of a group can feel the full emotional and intentional weight of a situation, when every perspective is genuinely accessible to every other perspective, and when the collective wisdom of the entire group is available to the decision-making process, the decisions that emerge from that process tend to be qualitatively different from the decisions produced by human deliberative systems. They tend to reflect the true needs and potentials of the situation more fully, to account for more of the relevant complexity, and to generate more genuine commitment from those who will implement them. This social system was not without its challenges. When the Lyran civilization spanned multiple star systems with populations on dozens of worlds, the telepathic field that made local consensus possible became attenuated over interstellar distances. This created genuine challenges for coordination between distant communities, and it is one of the factors that contributed to the increasing diversity and eventual divergence of Lyran communities as the civilization expanded. Different communities, separated by distances that limited direct telepathic contact, developed their own local variations of Lyran culture, their own philosophical emphases, their own technological specializations, and eventually their own distinct identities within the broader Lyran family. The Lyran relationship to creativity and art deserves particular attention because it reveals something essential about their character that is sometimes obscured by the emphasis on technology and social organization. The Lyrans were, at the deepest level, artists, not in the narrow sense of people who make decorative objects or perform for others' entertainment, but in the broadest and most essential sense, beings for whom creative expression was the primary mode of engagement with reality, beings who understood existence itself as an act of creation and who approached every aspect of their lives with the sensibility and the rigor of the dedicated artist. Their music was perhaps the most direct expression of this creative identity. Lyran music was not organized sound, arranged according to cultural conventions into forms that produce aesthetic pleasure, though it certainly achieved that. It was a technology of consciousness in its most refined form, a means of directly accessing and shaping the field of awareness through specific combinations of frequency, rhythm, and what might be called intentional resonance, the infusion of precise conscious intention into the vibrational patterns being created. Lyran music was experienced not just as sound, but as transformation. When a Lyran musical event occurred, whether it was an intimate performance between a handful of individuals or a great communal gathering involving thousands, the participants did not simply listen. They were actively changed by the experience in ways that were simultaneously deeply pleasurable and deeply clarifying, ways that opened perceptual capacities, deepened emotional intelligence, resolved tensions and confusions in the personal energy field, and reaffirmed the individual's connection to the larger field of consciousness within which they existed. Their visual arts were similarly integrated with their understanding of consciousness and reality. Lyran visual art was not simply the arrangement of colors and forms into aesthetically pleasing configurations. It was the precise manipulation of light, geometry, and energetic intention to create objects and environments that actively participated in the evolution of the consciousness that engaged with them. A Lyran sculpture was not simply beautiful. It was a precisely calibrated device for expanding the perception of anyone who spent time in its presence, a tool for consciousness development disguised as an aesthetic object. Their storytelling tradition was the vessel within which their entire history, philosophy, and accumulated wisdom was carried forward through time. The Lyrans had what might be called living libraries, vast repositories of experiential memory preserved not as written text or digital data, but as directly accessible fields of consciousness that any Lyran being could enter and participate in. These living libraries contained not just the intellectual content of historical events and philosophical discoveries, but the full experiential reality of them, including the emotional and sensory dimensions that written records can never fully capture. A Lyran who entered a living library to access a record of an event from 1,000 years before did not read about that event. They experienced it from the inside with the full richness of the original moment. This capacity to preserve and transmit experience directly, without the compression and distortion that inevitably accompanies translation into symbolic form, meant that Lyran culture accumulated wisdom at a rate that human cultures, dependent on imperfect symbolic transmission, cannot approach. Every generation did not have to rediscover from scratch the insights of the previous generation. They inherited those insights as direct experience, fully embodied and fully vivid, and were therefore freed to go further, rather than being perpetually obliged to return to the beginning. The spiritual dimension of Lyran civilization was not a separate department of life. It was the foundation from which everything else grew, the source from which all the various streams of Lyran cultural achievement derived their essential character. The Lyrans were, in the deepest sense, a spiritually organized civilization, meaning that their understanding of the nature and purpose of conscious existence was not an abstract philosophy relegated to temples and holy days, but the living framework within which all of their activities, from the most mundane to the most elevated, were understood and conducted. Their spiritual understanding was not organized into a religion in the sense that human beings would recognize. There were no dogmas, no sacred texts that claimed absolute authority, no priestly class with exclusive access to divine truth, no institutional structure for managing and transmitting spiritual knowledge. Instead, there was what might be called a living tradition, a continuously evolving body of understanding about the nature of consciousness and reality that was directly accessible to every member of society through their own experience and through their participation in the collective field of awareness. The core of this understanding was simple, though its implications were inexhaustible. All existence is consciousness. Physical matter is not the fundamental reality, but an expression of consciousness. Individual beings are not truly separate from each other or from the larger field of awareness within which they exist. The appearance of separation is a feature of physical existence, a creative device that allows consciousness to explore itself from apparently distinct perspectives, but it is not the ultimate reality. The ultimate reality is unity, the boundless field of awareness from which all apparently separate beings emerge and to which they all ultimately return. From this core understanding grew an ethical framework of great elegance and power. If all beings are fundamentally one consciousness experiencing itself through different forms, then harm to another is literally harm to oneself, not metaphorically, not as a moral teaching designed to encourage pro-social behavior. Literally, at the level of energetic and conscious reality, harm directed at any other being reverberates back through the unified field and is experienced by its originator. The Lyrans understood this not as a karmic law handed down by a deity, but as a natural consequence of the structure of reality, as empirically verifiable within their perceptual framework as the law of gravity is within ours. This understanding did not eliminate conflict from Lyran life, as we have noted, but it did mean that conflict, when it occurred, was engaged with a quality of consciousness that prevented it from generating the kind of self-perpetuating cycles of grievance and retaliation that characterize so much of human conflict. When two Lyran beings or communities came into conflict, both parties were aware of the connection between them, aware of the impact of their actions on the other, aware of their own participation in whatever dynamic had produced the conflict. This awareness did not always resolve the conflict, but it did prevent it from degenerating into the dehumanizing, if we can use that word about a non-human species, dynamic in which the other is seen as less than fully real, less than fully deserving of compassion and respect. At the height of their civilization, the Lyrans had developed this understanding to a level of practical mastery that produced a quality of collective life beyond anything that currently exists on Earth. Not a utopia in the sense of a place where nothing difficult ever happens, but a civilization in which the difficult things that do happen are met with a quality of awareness, compassion, and collective intelligence that maximizes the wisdom extracted from every experience and minimizes the unnecessary suffering generated by unconscious reaction. This was the world that was destroyed, the great cataclysm, the war that shook the stars. No subject in the study of Lyran civilization is more important, more complex, or more difficult to navigate without falling into oversimplification than the great cataclysm that ended the Lyran civilization at its height and scattered its people to the stars. This event, referred to in various source materials as the Lyran Wars, the Great War, the First Galactic Conflict, or simply the Destruction, represents the most pivotal moment in the history of this part of the galaxy, the moment from which all subsequent galactic history, including the history of Earth and humanity, most directly derives. Before we examine the cataclysm itself, we must understand the conditions that made it possible. Because the conventional narrative about the Lyran Wars, the narrative that presents it as a simple story of good Lyrans attacked by evil aggressors, misses the crucial complexity that makes the event genuinely instructive, rather than merely dramatic. The Lyran civilization, magnificent as it was, carried within it the seeds of its own disruption from very early in its development. We have described the extraordinary wisdom and the elevated consciousness of the Lyran people at their best, but we must also acknowledge, with the same honesty, that the Lyran civilization in its expansionary phase, the period when it was reaching outward to other star systems and establishing communities on new worlds, did not always carry that wisdom with it in its full expression. The challenge was one that every civilization faces as it grows: the inevitable gap between the wisdom of its most developed members and the average level of development of its general population. At the local, intimate scale of a single community, the telepathic transparency of Lyran social life and the sophistication of their living library tradition meant that wisdom could be genuinely shared, genuinely integrated into the collective culture. But as the civilization expanded across multiple star systems, as new communities formed on new worlds far from the original center, as the cumulative complexity of managing a multi-world civilization increased beyond what any single generation could fully absorb, that gap began to widen. There were Lyrans who had genuinely internalized the core spiritual understanding, who lived it in every dimension of their existence, for whom the unity of all consciousness was not a philosophical position, but a felt, immediate reality. And there were Lyrans, particularly among the younger, more recently developed populations on the frontier worlds, who understood it intellectually but had not yet embodied it fully, who could articulate the principle of unity while still experiencing themselves, in practice, as fundamentally separate and competitive. This gap between understanding and embodiment, between philosophical wisdom and lived reality, is the gap within which every form of shadow that afflicted the Lyran civilization eventually found room to grow. The most significant shadow that grew in this gap was what might be called the problem of power. The Lyrans possessed extraordinary power. Their technology could reshape worlds. Their understanding of consciousness gave them capacities that, to less developed beings, appeared as magical or divine. And the frontier populations of the Lyran expansion were interacting with other civilizations, some of which had developed very differently from the Lyran model, some of which were less technologically sophisticated, and some of which viewed the arrival of the Lyrans with fear, resentment, or the kind of competitive territorial response that arises naturally in beings who are operating from a predominantly ego-based consciousness. Within the Lyran civilization, different philosophical factions had developed different views on how the civilization should relate to less developed beings and civilizations. One tradition, which we might call the service to all perspective, held that the Lyrans' advanced development created an obligation to offer support, wisdom, and healing to less developed civilizations without imposing or dominating, to be neighbors and helpers rather than rulers or exploiters. Another tradition, whose adherents considered themselves practical realists, held that the Lyrans' development gave them not just the ability, but the right to organize the galactic neighborhood according to their superior understanding, to shape the development of less advanced civilizations in ways that would produce outcomes aligned with Lyran values and Lyran needs, to be, in effect, galactic managers. This second perspective, while it could articulate itself in philosophical terms that made it sound like enlightened wisdom, was in fact a rationalization of what is essentially a colonial mindset. The belief that superior development confers the right to determine the fate of the less developed, that the advanced need not seek consent from those whose advancement they presume to manage. And it is precisely this mindset, operating at galactic scale with Lyran levels of technology and power, that created the conditions for the catastrophe. There was, according to multiple sources, a significant interaction between the Lyrans and another civilization at some point in the period of Lyran expansion. This other civilization is identified differently by different sources, but there is general agreement on certain characteristics. They were highly intelligent, technologically sophisticated, deeply committed to a hierarchical social organization, and operating from a fundamentally different understanding of the nature and purpose of existence than the Lyrans had developed. Some sources identify these beings as the earliest ancestors of what later became known as the reptilian civilizations of this galaxy. Others describe them as a distinct entity altogether, a civilization that had developed in a very different corner of the galaxy under very different conditions and had arrived at a fundamentally different set of answers to the questions about consciousness, identity, and the proper organization of galactic society. In either case, the essential characteristics of this civilization, as relevant to understanding the conflict with the Lyrans, were a consciousness organized primarily around the perspective of separation rather than unity, a social philosophy built on hierarchy and dominance rather than consensus and service, a relationship to power that was acquisitive and competitive rather than regenerative and cooperative, and a deep and perhaps reasonable suspicion of the Lyran civilization's expansion into regions of space that they regarded as their own territory. The conflict that developed between the Lyrans and this civilization was not a simple matter of good versus evil. It was a clash of two very different ways of being conscious, two very different answers to the fundamental questions of existence, two very different visions of how galactic society should be organized. And it was made infinitely more tragic by the fact that within the Lyran civilization itself, there were already those who had adopted or were susceptible to aspects of the very consciousness they were in conflict with. The Lyran faction that had embraced the colonial managerial attitude toward less developed civilizations was, in a very real sense, already partway toward the consciousness framework of their adversaries, already operating from a place of separation rather than unity, already using their power as a tool of dominance rather than of service. When the conflict began, this faction did not respond with the wisdom of the Lyran tradition. It responded with force, with the full weight of Lyran technology deployed as a weapon. And what Lyran technology could do as a weapon was something that other civilizations in the galaxy had no equivalent for. The accounts of the Lyran Wars describe events of a scale and violence that are almost incomprehensible from the perspective of current human experience. These were not conventional military conflicts fought with ships and soldiers over limited geographic territories. These were conflicts that involved the directed application of energetic and physical forces capable of altering the atmospheres of planets, destabilizing the gravitational dynamics of star systems, and in at least one account, literally destroying a world. The Lyran home system, or systems, were targeted specifically because the adversary recognized that the source of Lyran power was their homeworld, the living center of their civilization from which all the threads of their culture and consciousness radiated outward. The details of the military engagements are less important than their consequences, which were catastrophic at a level that redefined the meaning of the word. The Lyran homeworlds were destroyed, not damaged, not conquered, destroyed. The planets themselves were reduced to debris fields. The living civilizations they had supported, the cities, the living libraries, the healing centers, the artistic traditions, the entire accumulated achievement of millions of years of conscious development was obliterated. The death toll was incalculable. The civilizational loss was total. But it was not quite complete, because the Lyrans had warning. Not enough warning to prevent the catastrophe, but enough to do what any people facing annihilation will do if they have the capacity. They fled. In the period before the worst of the destruction, Lyran ships carrying refugees, scholars, healers, wisdom keepers, seeds, genetic samples, living library fragments, and whatever else could be saved in the time available, departed the home system in every direction, carrying the survivors of a civilization into an uncertain future among the stars. This exodus was not organized, it was desperate. It was the scattered flight of survivors, not a planned migration. Different ships went to different destinations. Some carried large populations. Some carried small groups, or even individuals. Some arrived at inhabited systems and negotiated for settlement rights. Some found uninhabited worlds and began the work of building new communities from nothing. Some were lost. Some were captured by the adversarial civilization and suffered fates that are not described in detail in the sources, but which are implied to have been terrible. The psychological impact of this experience on the Lyran people cannot be overstated. These were beings who had developed over millions of years, a civilization of extraordinary depth and beauty. Beings who had achieved a level of consciousness and a quality of collective life that represented, they believed, the flowering of what physical existence could be. Beings whose connection to their home world, to the living landscape and ecosystem that had been their cradle for millions of years was not merely sentimental, but existential, a deep biological and spiritual bond that was as much a part of their identity as their physical form. To lose that homeworld, to watch it destroyed from the windows of fleeing ships, was a trauma that went beyond anything the word trauma can adequately capture in a human context. It was the severing of the deepest root. It was the death of the world that had made them who they were, not just as a civilization, but as a species, as beings whose very bodies had evolved in relationship to that specific planet, that specific light, that specific gravitational field, that specific ecosystem. The Lyrans who survived the destruction of their homeworlds carried that loss with them in every cell of their bodies, in every dimension of their consciousness, for the rest of their very long lives. And yet, as is true of great suffering in every tradition and in every dimension of existence, that loss did not destroy them, it transformed them. The wisdom that the Lyrans carry now, the depth of compassion, the fierce commitment to the preservation of life and consciousness in all its forms, the understanding of what is truly at stake in the choices that advanced civilizations make about the use of their power, the urgency they feel about the awakening of humanity, and the other younger civilizations that carry the Lyran template, these did not exist before the destruction. They were forged in the fire of it. Before the destruction, the Lyrans were magnificent. After it, they became wise. And the difference between those two states, between magnificence and wisdom, is the entire content of the lesson that the Lyran story exists to teach. There is another dimension to the Lyran Wars that is less often discussed in the popular literature, but which several serious researchers consider essential to a complete understanding of the event. This is the internal dimension, the ways in which the conflict that destroyed the Lyran civilization from without was enabled and amplified by the conflicts within the Lyran civilization that had been building for millions of years. We have described the philosophical division within Lyran society between those who embraced the service to all orientation and those who had adopted the colonial, managerial orientation. This division was real and significant, but it was not the only internal conflict that characterized the later Lyran civilization. There were also conflicts between the different biological subtypes of the Lyran species, the Nordic, the avian, and the leonine varieties, and the various hybrid forms between them. There were conflicts between the older, established communities on the homeworlds and the younger, more dynamically developing communities on the frontier worlds. There were conflicts between those who valued technological development above all else and those who believed that spiritual development should set the pace of technological advancement. And there were conflicts between those who sought engagement with the broader galactic community, including the civilization that would ultimately destroy them, and those who counseled a more cautious and internally focused approach. In each of these conflicts, there are echoes that will be immediately familiar to anyone paying attention to human civilization in the current era. The same tensions between service and dominance, between inclusion and exclusion, between technological hubris and spiritual wisdom, between engagement and isolation, are playing out in human civilization today, at a scale and with an urgency that suggests the moment of crisis is not far distant. This is not coincidental. The Lyran Wars are not simply ancient history. They are, for the descendants of the Lyran diaspora who now populate Earth, living memory, encoded in the patterns of trauma and wisdom that shape human behavior at the deepest levels. One particularly significant aspect of the internal Lyran conflict that deserves special attention is what various sources describe as the emergence of a separatist faction within the Lyran civilization, a group who had moved so far from the core Lyran spiritual understanding that they had essentially become a different kind of being, one that operated from a consciousness of profound separation, and that had developed technologies and practices designed not to support the evolution of consciousness, but to trap and control it. These beings, sometimes referred to as the Fallen Lyrans or the Dark Ones in various channeled accounts, are described as having discovered the mechanisms by which consciousness can be artificially limited, by which the natural permeability of awareness can be blocked, by which beings can be kept in a state of enforced separation from their own deeper nature and from each other. This discovery was the most dangerous and the most consequential that the Lyran civilization produced. not because the knowledge itself was evil, but because of the uses to which it was put. A civilization of beings who understand how to block consciousness and enforce separation has discovered the technology of control at its most fundamental level. Not the crude control of physical force, which can always be resisted by those with sufficient courage and sufficient numbers, but the subtle control of perception and awareness, which is far more difficult to resist because the beings being controlled do not know they are being controlled. They experience their limited perception as normal, as the natural state of awareness, because they have no reference point for the fuller state of consciousness that has been blocked from them. This is a scenario that will resonate powerfully with those who have spent any time studying the various theories about the suppression of human consciousness and the manipulation of human history. The parallel is not accidental. The technology of consciousness suppression that was developed within the Lyran civilization and weaponized by those who had abandoned the Lyran spiritual tradition is, according to many sources, the same technology that has been applied to humanity on Earth, with consequences that continue to shape human experience to this day. The Lyran wars therefore need to be understood at multiple levels simultaneously. At the physical level, they were a military conflict of extraordinary destructive power that resulted in the destruction of the Lyran homeworlds and the scattering of the Lyran people across the galaxy. At the political level, they were the expression of irreconcilable differences in the philosophy of galactic organization between the Lyran civilization and its adversary. At the spiritual level, they were the outer manifestation of an inner conflict that had been building within the Lyran civilization for millions of years, a conflict between the tradition of service and wisdom and the growing shadow of separation and control. And at the cosmic level, they were a moment of karmic resolution, the point at which the consequences of choices made over a very long period arrived in their full weight and produced the transformation that only such an overwhelming crisis could have forced. Out of the ruins of the greatest civilization this galaxy had known, the survivors carried forward not just their bodies and whatever physical artifacts they had managed to save. They carried forward a question, the most urgent question that conscious beings can ask. How do we ensure that this never happens again? How do we build a galactic civilization that is genuinely wise enough to prevent the use of power in ways that destroy what is most precious? How do we heal the wound of separation, both in ourselves and in the civilizations and beings around us, before that wound becomes lethal? The rest of Lyran history, from the moment of the Great Diaspora to the present day, is the story of their attempt to find answers to that question, and humanity, whether we know it or not, is the centerpiece of the most ambitious expression of that attempt. The Great Diaspora, seeding a galaxy. The Lyran diaspora was one of the most significant events in the history of this galaxy. When the homeworlds fell and the survivors scattered, they carried with them not just their lives and their memories, but the entire biological, cultural, and spiritual inheritance of the oldest humanoid civilization in the galactic community. And as they settled on new worlds, as they established new communities and new civilizations in the centuries and millennia following the destruction, they did not simply reproduce themselves in new locations. They diversified, adapted, evolved, and in many cases deliberately modified the Lyran template to create new and distinct humanoid races suited to new and different environments and purposes. This process of deliberate humanoid seeding across the galaxy is one of the most controversial aspects of the Lyran legacy, and it is worth examining carefully before we trace the major threads of the diaspora. The controversy centers on a question of ethics. What gave the Lyrans the right to introduce humanoid life into star systems that were already inhabited by other forms of life, potentially disrupting existing ecosystems and evolutionary trajectories? What gave them the right to genetically modify their own template to create new forms of beings who would then have their own consciousness, their own destinies, their own rights, but who had not consented to their own creation? These are real ethical questions, and the Lyran sources do not entirely dismiss them. What they offer instead is a framework of understanding within which the seeding process makes sense as a response to the specific circumstances the Lyrans found themselves in following the destruction of their home worlds. The Lyran diaspora was not a calm, considered project undertaken by a civilization at the height of its power and wisdom. It was the desperate, grief-driven, often chaotic response of traumatized survivors trying to ensure that everything that had been lost would not be entirely lost, that the spark of Lyran consciousness would continue, that the wisdom so painfully earned would not die with the civilization that had earned it. The genetic seeding of other worlds with humanoid life was, at least in part, an act of preservation, of planting the template in as many places as possible so that no single catastrophe could ever again eliminate it entirely. It was also, in the best of its expressions, an act of service. The Lyrans understood that the humanoid template they carried was not their private property. It was a gift from the progenitor races, a design intended to serve the evolution of consciousness throughout the galaxy. By spreading that template as widely as possible, the Lyrans were fulfilling, however imperfectly and under however difficult circumstances, the intention with which the template had been created, to populate the galaxy with beings capable of the full range of humanoid experience, beings who could contribute their unique perspectives to the ongoing conversation of consciousness that is the deeper purpose of galactic civilization. With that context in mind, let us trace the major threads of the Lyran diaspora and the civilizations that grew from them. The most directly documented and most important thread from the perspective of human history is the one that led to the Pleiades. Among the first and largest of the Lyran refugee groups were those who made their way to the Pleiades star cluster, a group of hot blue stars approximately 444 light-years from Earth. The Pleiades cluster contains hundreds of stars, only a handful of which are visible to the naked eye from Earth, and among those hundreds, certain ones were found to have planetary systems capable of supporting humanoid life. The Lyran refugees who settled in the Pleiades brought with them the full richness of their home civilization, including sophisticated agricultural technology, advanced healing knowledge, the remnants of their living library tradition, and the deep spiritual understanding that had been the foundation of Lyran culture. They established communities on multiple Pleiadian worlds, and over the centuries and millennia that followed, those communities grew, diversified, and eventually developed into a distinct and powerful civilization in their own right, one that retained clear connections to its Lyran origin, while also developing its own unique characteristics. The Pleiadians, as they came to be known, are perhaps the most extensively documented of the Lyran-derived civilizations in the modern contactee literature. Billy Meyer's decades-long contact with Pleiadian beings, particularly with the individual known as Semjaz, produced an enormous body of information about Pleiadian history, culture, and their relationship to humanity. The Pleiadians contacted by Meyer were explicit about their Lyran origins, describing in detail the history of the refugee exodus and the eventual establishment of the Pleiadian civilization. They were equally explicit about their connection to humanity, describing the specific ways in which Pleiadian genetics had been incorporated into the human genome in ancient times, and the ongoing relationship between Pleiadian civilization and the development of Earth. The Pleiadians, as described in the Meyer material and in the broader channeled literature, are physically similar to the Nordic Lyran type, tall, fair, luminous, with the distinctive large eyes and the extraordinary longevity of their Lyran ancestors. Their civilization, while retaining the essential Lyran qualities of spiritual depth and technological sophistication, has developed in ways that reflect both the trauma of the original exile and the specific character of the Pleiadian star systems they inhabit. One of the most significant ways in which Pleiadian civilization differs from the original Lyran model is in its relationship to emotion. The Lyran civilization, in its mature expression, achieved a balance between the full experience of emotion and the wisdom to channel that experience productively. The Pleiadians, shaped by the trauma of exile and by the specific emotional qualities of their star systems, developed an even deeper and more explicit engagement with the emotional dimension of experience. They are described by those who have encountered them as extraordinarily sensitive beings, capable of emotional depths that even the Lyrans sometimes found overwhelming. And this emotional depth is regarded by many researchers as one of the most important gifts the Pleiadian contribution made to the human genetic and consciousness template. The second major thread of the Lyran diaspora led to what is known in the galactic community as the Syrian system, the star system centered on the brilliant blue-white star Sirius A and its dwarf companion Sirius B. The Lyran refugees who made their way to Sirius settled initially on worlds in the planetary system that, while not directly orbiting the stars visible to us today, were associated with the broader Syrian system as understood in the galactic mapping framework of the time. The Syrian civilization that developed from the Lyran refugees is described in the source literature as significantly different in character from the Pleadean civilization, reflecting both the different environmental conditions of the Syrian system and the different composition of the refugee population that settled there. The Syrians who developed from this branch of the diaspora are described as highly analytical, architecturally minded, deeply committed to what might be called cosmic engineering, the deliberate shaping of planetary and stellar systems to optimize conditions for the development of consciousness. The Syrian civilization's most significant contribution to the story we are telling is their deep involvement with Earth, which predates the arrival of the Pleiadians in Earth's story and which represents the longest continuous extraterrestrial engagement with this planet. The Syrian connection to ancient Egypt has been extensively documented by researchers from Robert Temple, whose work on the Dogon and their knowledge of Sirius created significant controversy in academic circles, to more recent researchers in the alternative history community who have noted the extraordinary astronomical precision of Egyptian temple alignments with Sirius and the very specific ways in which Syrian beings appear in Egyptian iconography. The Syrian beings described in the Lyran diaspora framework are of multiple types, reflecting the creative experimentation that characterized the post-diaspora period. Some are described as fully humanoid in the Lyran tradition. Others are described as amphibious humanoids, reflecting the adaptation to the specific aquatic world they settled on in the Syrian system. Still others represent the deliberate application of Lyran genetic engineering to create beings suited to very different environmental conditions. The diversity of Syrian types is as great as the diversity of Lyran types, and in both cases, it reflects the underlying principle of adaptation and creative experimentation that characterize the humanoid lineage from its very beginnings. The third major thread of the diaspora led to the star system of Arcturus, the brilliant orange giant visible in Earth's northern sky as part of the constellation Bodas. The Lyran refugees who settled in what would become the Arcturian civilization represented, according to multiple sources, the most spiritually advanced element of the diaspora population. They were the teachers, the wisdom keepers, the philosophers who carried the deepest expressions of the Lyran spiritual tradition, and the civilization they built reflected that priority. The Arcturian civilization is described as the most spiritually advanced of all the Lyran-derived civilizations in this galaxy, a civilization that has made the development and refinement of consciousness its primary work, and that has achieved levels of spiritual mastery that exceed even the best expressions of the original Lyran tradition. The Arcturians are described as beings who have largely transcended the need for physical embodiment, who can function in both physical and non-physical dimensions with equal facility, and who serve the rest of the galactic community primarily as healers, teachers, and guides for the evolution of consciousness. Their direct involvement with Earth is less dramatic and less well documented in the contactee literature than the involvement of the Pleiadians or the Syrians, but it is described by those who do discuss it as perhaps the most profound in its nature. The Arcturians are said to work primarily at the level of consciousness rather than at the level of physical contact or genetic interaction, influencing the development of human spiritual understanding and healing through a kind of continuous energetic transmission that operates largely below the threshold of ordinary human awareness. There are other significant threads of the Lyran diaspora that deserve mention, even if we cannot trace each one in the same detail. The Andromedan connection, which is particularly relevant given that Alex Collier's primary extraterrestrial sources were Andromedan beings, represents another branch of the diaspora that traveled to the Andromeda galaxy itself. This is one of the more challenging aspects of the Lyran story for some researchers. since Andromeda is approximately 2.5 million light-years from Earth, a distance that seems to challenge even the most generous assumptions about interstellar travel technology. But the Andromedan sources themselves describe this migration as occurring over an extraordinarily long time scale, with multiple generations passing during the journey in ships that were essentially self-contained civilizations. There were also Lyran refugees who made their way to star systems closer to the galactic center, including what are described as the vegan civilization, centered on the star Vega, which of course was among the closest of the Lyran system stars. The vegans, who settled on worlds orbiting their ancestral star, represent perhaps the most genetically pure continuation of the original Lyran template, having not traveled as far or experienced as much environmental diversity as some of the other diaspora groups. They are described as taller and more physically robust than either the Pleadians or the Syrians, retaining many of the original Nordic Lyran physical characteristics while developing their own distinct cultural identity. What is remarkable about all these diaspora civilizations, despite their enormous diversity, is the thread of coherence that runs through all of them, the core spiritual understanding that consciousness is primary and that service to the evolution of all beings is the highest calling appears in every one of the Lyran-derived civilizations, even in those that have strayed furthest from the original template in their physical form and cultural expression. It is this thread of coherence, this shared inheritance, that makes it possible to speak of a galactic community of humanoid civilizations that are, despite their differences, recognizably kin. The story of the Lyran diaspora is also the story of the beginning of what various sources call the Galactic Federation, or the Galactic Confederation of Worlds, a broad alliance of humanoid civilizations that developed in the aftermath of the Lyran Wars as a mechanism for preventing the kind of catastrophe that had destroyed the Lyran homeworlds from ever happening again. The specifics of this confederation, its structure, its membership, its decision-making processes, and its relationship to Earth and humanity are subjects we will return to in later sections of this exploration. For now, what is important to understand is that the Confederation represents the Lyran's collective answer to the question that the wars had forced upon them: how to create a galactic civilization wise enough to prevent its own destruction. The Confederation was not formed immediately after the diaspora. It took time, many generations, and many painful lessons for the surviving Lyran-derived civilizations to develop the trust and the shared framework necessary to work together effectively. There were conflicts among the diaspora civilizations themselves, echoes of the internal Lyran conflicts that had contributed to the original catastrophe. There were periods of isolation, of mutual suspicion, of competitive positioning that threatened to reproduce, at a smaller scale, the dynamics that had destroyed the original civilization. But there were also beings of great wisdom in each of the diaspora civilizations who understood what was at stake, who could see the larger pattern, and who worked tirelessly to build the bridges of understanding and mutual recognition that would eventually make the Confederation possible. These beings are remembered in the traditions of each of the Lyran-derived civilizations as founders, teachers, or great ones, beings whose individual contribution to the collective development of their civilization was of such magnitude that their names and stories became part of the core cultural inheritance passed down through every subsequent generation. The Lyran diaspora, in all its diversity, complexity, and suffering, is ultimately a story about the persistence of life, about the determination of consciousness to continue its journey regardless of the obstacles placed in its path. The Lyrans lost everything that their civilization had built. Everything that they had taken millions of years to create was destroyed in what, on a cosmic timescale, was the blink of an eye. And yet they survived, and not only survived, but used the experience of destruction as the catalyst for a deeper and more genuine wisdom than they had possessed before, and carried that wisdom, encoded in their genetics and in their consciousness, into every corner of the galaxy they touched. And eventually, through a long and complex chain of deliberate genetic intervention, they carried it to Earth. Lyrans and Earth, the ancient connection. The connection between the Lyran civilization and planet Earth is not a modern phenomenon. It is not something that began with the UFO sightings of the 20th century, or with the contactee experiences that followed. or with the emergence of channeled information about extraterrestrial civilizations that began flowing through human receivers in the mid-20th century. The Lyran connection to Earth is ancient, unimaginably ancient by the standard of human historical time. It stretches back further than any civilization currently recognized by mainstream archaeology, further than the oldest cities, further than the oldest written languages, further, if the sources are to be believed, than the emergence of anatomically modern human beings in the form we currently recognize. To understand the Lyran connection to Earth, we must first understand something about Earth itself that conventional science is only beginning to recognize: that this planet is not an ordinary world. In the vast catalog of inhabitable planets that populate the galaxy, Earth represents something extraordinary, a world of such biological richness, such ecological complexity, such energetic vitality, that it has attracted the attention of multiple extraterrestrial civilizations since the earliest periods of its formation. The biodiversity of Earth, the extraordinary range of life forms that have developed here across billions of years, is not simply the product of mechanical evolutionary forces operating on an average world. It reflects a combination of factors, some natural and some deliberately engineered, that have made Earth a living laboratory of biological creativity, unlike almost anything else in this part of the galaxy. The natural factors include a specific position within the galaxy in what cosmologists call the galactic habitable zone, far enough from the violent, radiation-intense galactic core to be stable, close enough to have access to the heavy elements that complex chemistry requires. They include the specific characteristics of our Sun, a G-type star of moderate age and exceptional stability by stellar standards, which produces a relatively consistent and life-supporting spectrum of radiation. They include the presence of a large moon in the specific orbital relationship it has with Earth, which stabilizes our axial tilt, and therefore our seasons, and which drives the tidal dynamics that played a crucial role in the development of life. And they include a specific combination of planetary mass, atmospheric composition, and surface water abundance that has made Earth uniquely hospitable to the emergence and persistence of complex biological life. But according to the sources we are drawing on, these natural factors alone do not entirely account for Earth's extraordinary biological richness. Alongside the natural factors, there have been deliberate interventions by extraterrestrial civilizations who recognized Earth's extraordinary potential and chose to support, guide, and in some cases, directly engineer the development of its biosphere. The most significant of these interventions, from the perspective of human origins, were those conducted by civilizations with Lyran ancestry, the Syrians, the Pleadians, and in some accounts, Lyran beings directly. The timeline of extraterrestrial involvement with Earth, as described in the sources, stretches back hundreds of millions of years. The earliest interventions were biological, the introduction of specific genetic material from other worlds into Earth's evolutionary stream, seeding the planet with biological information that would eventually, through the machinery of natural evolution, enhanced by periodic deliberate intervention, produce the extraordinary diversity of life we see today. This is not the creation story of any particular religion, nor is it the simple dismissal of evolutionary biology. It is a more complex model in which natural evolutionary processes and deliberate biological stewardship interact across immense timescales to produce outcomes that neither process alone could have achieved. The specific involvement of Lyran-derived civilizations with Earth and with human beings began in earnest in the period we might call the pre-human era, the period roughly 1 to 2 million years ago, when the hominid line that would eventually produce Homo sapiens was already well established on Earth, but had not yet achieved the specific form or the specific consciousness that characterizes our species. It was during this period that a series of deliberate genetic interventions occurred, interventions that accelerated the development of the human brain, expanded the emotional and spiritual capacities of the human template, and introduced into the human genetic line a series of specific encodings drawn from Lyran, Pleadean, Syrian, and other humanoid genetics. These interventions are described in the sources with a level of detail that goes far beyond the vague references to genetic engineering that characterize most popular treatments of the ancient alien hypothesis. What is described is not a single event, but a long series of carefully staged interventions, conducted over hundreds of thousands of years by multiple civilizations, working sometimes in coordination and sometimes independently, each contributing different elements to a final design whose full intention was understood only by those who were working from the longest view of human potential. The Lyran contribution to the human genome is described as foundational, the basic humanoid template, the fundamental architecture of the physical form, the specific brain structures that enable the uniquely human combination of abstract reasoning and emotional depth, the particular geometry of the DNA itself. All of these reflect the Lyran contribution at the deepest level. Humanity is, in the most literal biological sense, a child of Lyra. Not in the oversimplified sense that Lyrans came to Earth and had children with early humans, though there are accounts of something like that as well. In the deeper sense that the core design of the human being, the template around which all subsequent development has been organized, was originally a Lyran design, adapted and refined through the long process of the galactic diaspora before being introduced into Earth's evolutionary stream. The Pleadean contribution is described as primarily emotional and spiritual, the deepening of the human emotional range and the enhancement of the innate human capacity for intuitive and spiritual knowing. The Lyran base template was, by Pleadean standards, somewhat emotionally limited in its original expression on Earth. The Pleadean contribution was the addition of a richness and sensitivity of emotional experience that is one of the most distinctive features of the human consciousness profile, the ability to feel with extraordinary depth and nuance across the full spectrum from grief to ecstasy, and to use that feeling as a primary mode of knowing rather than simply as background noise to the more cognitive functions. The Syrian contribution is described as primarily intellectual and architectural, the enhancement of the human capacity for complex abstract thought, for spatial reasoning, for the kind of structured logical analysis that eventually produces mathematical and scientific reasoning. The Syrian civilizations are described as among the most analytically sophisticated in the galactic community, and their contribution to the human genome reflects that specialty, an enhancement of the left hemisphere cognitive functions that, in balanced interaction with the emotional intelligence of the Pleadean contribution and the spiritual awareness of the Lyran base template, was intended to produce a being of extraordinary integrated intelligence. There were other contributions as well, from civilizations we have not yet fully explored, including contributions from what various sources describe as the avian races, from the reptilian civilizations in their more service-oriented expressions, and from several less commonly discussed humanoid races. The human genome, in the framework we are exploring, is not the product of a single designer or a single design philosophy. It is a collaborative creation, the result of a galactic consortium of civilizations, each contributing their particular genius to a shared project whose purpose was nothing less than the creation of a new kind of consciousness in the universe. What kind of consciousness? This is perhaps the most important question in the entire Lyran story as it relates to Earth. What was the intention behind the creation of humanity? What was the design goal that motivated this extraordinary collaborative project? The answer, as it emerges from multiple independent sources, is at once simpler and more profound than most people expect. The intention was to create a being who could bridge the full range of consciousness from the most embodied, most physically immersed form of awareness to the most expanded, most cosmically connected form of awareness in a single integrated package. A being who could be simultaneously deeply physical and deeply spiritual, who could experience the full richness of material existence, including its suffering and its pleasure, its limitation and its beauty, while also maintaining the thread of connection to the larger consciousness from which physical existence emerges. This is the design specification for the human being as originally intended, and looking at what humanity has demonstrated, even in its current limited and largely suppressed state of development, it is possible to see the outline of that design. Human beings are simultaneously the most emotionally intense, the most creatively explosive, and the most spiritually diverse species in the galactic community. When humans develop their potential, the combinations they produce of art and science, of mysticism and mathematics, of fierce individuality and profound collective consciousness are without parallel in the galactic neighborhood. Even the civilizations that are far more developed than humanity in specific dimensions of capability, including the Pleadians, the Syrians, and the Arcturians themselves, acknowledge that the human profile of consciousness contains potentials they do not have, precisely because of the extraordinary combination of ingredients that went into its creation. The practical history of extraterrestrial involvement with Earth in the ancient period is reflected, fragmentarily and imperfectly, but unmistakably, in the mythological and religious traditions of every major human culture. The stories of gods who came from the sky and interacted with early human beings are not primitive metaphors for natural forces or projections of human psychological archetypes, though they carry those dimensions as well. They are memories, encoded in the only language available to the cultures that preserve them, of actual beings, of actual events, of an actual relationship between humanity and its extraterrestrial progenitors that was direct, personal, and of enormous consequence. In ancient Sumer, the oldest literate civilization in the historical record, the gods known as the Anunnaki are described in extraordinary detail across thousands of clay tablets as beings who came from the sky and the stars, who were physically present among early human beings, who taught them agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law, and who were directly involved in the genetic shaping of the human species. The Sumerian creation accounts describe a process of genetic modification that sounds remarkably like what modern geneticists would recognize as directed genetic engineering, conducted by beings who clearly understood the mechanics of biology at a sophisticated level. The interpretation of the Anunnaki as extraterrestrials of the Lyran lineage is not universally accepted, and there are valid debates about the details. Some researchers identify the Anunnaki specifically with Syrian or Pleadean beings. Others suggest they represent a composite of multiple extraterrestrial civilizations interacting with early humanity in the same geographic region during overlapping time periods. What is consistent across all the serious interpretive frameworks is the recognition that the Sumerian accounts describe real beings of non-human origin who were genuinely present in the ancient Middle East and who played a formative role in the development of the civilization that emerged there. In ancient Egypt, the connection to the Lyran diaspora is perhaps most clearly encoded in the astronomical record. The orientation of the three great pyramids at Giza to the belt stars of Orion, documented extensively by researcher Robert Bauval, points to a date of approximately 10,500 BCE for the original design of the pyramid complex, a date that significantly predates the conventionally accepted age of Egyptian civilization and that aligns with a period when the Lyran connection to Earth was, according to multiple sources, at its most direct. The Sphinx, oriented toward the constellation Leo and positioned precisely to observe the rising of Leo on the horizon at the spring equinox during the same era, is read by these researchers as a marker deliberately placed by beings who understood both the astronomical significance of the precession of the equinoxes and the symbolic significance of the leonine imagery, the latter being a direct reference to the leonine Lyran lineage. The Egyptian tradition preserved, in its theological and cosmological framework, a remarkably intact version of the Lyran understanding of consciousness and reality. The Central Egyptian concept of Ma'at, the cosmic order and truth that sustain all existence, is a direct cultural expression of the Lyran understanding that consciousness is the fundamental reality and that alignment with its nature produces harmony, while deviation from it produces suffering. The Egyptian concept of the soul, the various components of human consciousness, including the Ka, the Ba, and the Ak, reflects a sophisticated understanding of multi-level consciousness that is fully consistent with the Lyran model of quantum consciousness described earlier. The ancient Indian traditions carry perhaps the most intact and most philosophically sophisticated version of the Lyran cosmic understanding. the Vedic tradition, with its central recognition that Brahman, the unlimited field of consciousness, is the only ultimate reality, that individual souls are expressions of that field, temporarily exploring separation as an adventure of the cosmic self, that the purpose of physical existence is the accumulation of experience and the eventual return to full self-knowledge, represents the Lyran spiritual understanding, translated into the language and cultural framework of the Indian subcontinent. The Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the great works of Vedantic philosophy, all carry the fingerprints of a cosmological understanding far older than the civilizations that preserved them, an understanding that can be traced back through the chain of transmission to its extraterrestrial origins. The ancient cultures of the Americas, particularly those of the Mayan and Aztec traditions in Mesoamerica and the Andean traditions of South America, also carry significant elements of the Lyran connection, though filtered through very different cultural frameworks. The Mayan obsession with astronomical cycles and the precision of their calendar system reflects the same understanding of cosmic time and the larger patterns of galactic history that characterizes the Lyran perspective. The Mayan concept of the galactic center as the source of cosmic intelligence, and their tracking of the precession of the equinoxes as a marker of specific phases in a long cycle of galactic development, reflects a knowledge base that goes far beyond what indigenous observation of the night sky alone could have produced. The indigenous traditions of North America, Australia, Africa, and the Pacific Islands all carry similar elements, stories of star ancestors who taught the first humans how to live, who brought knowledge from the sky, who shaped the consciousness of early humanity, and then withdrew, promising to return when the time was right. These traditions are not merely metaphorical, they are historical accounts, told in the language of symbol and story because that was the only language available to the cultures that preserved them, of a real history that is only now, in the current era of awakening human consciousness, beginning to be decoded and understood in its full depth and significance. This period of withdrawal was not a random abandonment. It was a decision made within the galactic community, including by the Lyran-derived civilizations most invested in Earth's development, that the next phase of human evolution needed to proceed without direct intervention, that humanity needed to develop its capacities through the crucible of its own experience, rather than being guided, however wisely, by beings whose power vastly exceeded its own. This decision was painful for many of the beings who made it. The Pleadean sources in particular have described their grief at withdrawing from direct physical involvement with humanity, their attachment to the beings they had seeded and developed and come to love as their own children. But they recognized, and this is itself an expression of the wisdom the Lyran Wars had taught them, that premature assistance is sometimes the most profound form of harm, that some lessons can only be learned through direct experience, and that humanity needed the freedom to find its own way, however difficult that way might prove to be. They did not, however, disappear entirely. The withdrawal was from physical presence, not from energetic engagement. Throughout the period of human recorded history, from the earliest civilizations to the present day, the Lyran-derived civilizations have maintained a continuous energetic transmission to humanity, a subtle but constant flow of information, inspiration, and consciousness support that works through the dimensions of human experience that are most receptive to it. Dream states, meditation, intuitive insight, creative inspiration, synchronistic experience, and the profound depths of human spiritual seeking. The great teachers, mystics, artists, and philosophers of human history have, in this framework, been operating at least in part as receivers and transmitters of this continuous extraterrestrial transmission, translating the frequencies of a wider cosmic intelligence into the specific cultural and philosophical languages of their time and place. This understanding reframes the entire history of human spiritual and creative achievement. The great sacred traditions, the mystical mathematics of the Pythagoreans, the architectural genius of the ancient builders, the medical wisdom of the Hippocratic tradition, the philosophical depth of the great Eastern and Western schools, the visionary art of every culture and era, are not simply the products of individual human genius developing in a vacuum. They are the fruits of a continuous collaboration between human receivers and their extraterrestrial guides. a collaboration that has been ongoing for thousands of years, and that has been preparing humanity for exactly the moment we are currently living through, the moment of full awakening, of open contact, of the beginning of humanity's conscious participation in the wider galactic family. The ancient connection between the Lyrans and Earth is therefore not merely history, it is the foundation of the present and the key to the future. Understanding it fully in all its complexity and all its beauty and all its shadows is not an intellectual exercise. It is, for anyone who takes it seriously, a profound personal awakening, a recognition of one's own place in a story so vast and so meaningful that the small human drama of daily life is suddenly seen in a completely different light, not as the whole story, but as one precious thread in a tapestry of inconceivable richness. The Lyran agenda. What do they truly want? Of all the questions that arise in the study of extraterrestrial civilizations and their relationship to humanity, none is more immediately pressing, none more practically significant, and none more subject to misinterpretation and projected fear than this one. What do they want? In the case of the Lyrans, the beings who are alleged to be our most ancient ancestors, the question carries particular weight. If they are genuinely our progenitors, if humanity is in some real and meaningful sense their creation and their responsibility, then their agenda with respect to Earth and human beings is not a peripheral geopolitical question. It is a question about the purpose of our existence. Let us begin by clearing away the most common misconceptions. The Lyran agenda is not, according to any credible source in the serious research literature, primarily about material exploitation. The civilizations that are described as interested in Earth for its physical resources, its minerals, its biological material, or its strategic galactic position are generally identified as other groups, some of them adversarial from the Lyran perspective, rather than the Lyrans themselves. The Lyrans are described as being long past the phase of civilizational development at which material resources would motivate significant engagement with another world. A civilization that is hundreds of millions of years old and that has mastered consciousness-based technology has access to material resources far beyond anything Earth could provide. Material exploitation as a motive for Lyran involvement with Earth does not survive serious examination. Neither is the Lyran agenda primarily about power or control. The civilizations described as oriented toward control, the various factions that have contested influence over Earth's development throughout its history, are generally identified as distinct from the Lyran mainstream, though some of them carry Lyran genetics. The core Lyran agenda, as described by the Lyran and Lyran-derived sources that have communicated with human contacts, is organized around something that is simultaneously simpler and more profound than either exploitation or control. They want humanity to remember. This is the essential Lyran agenda, and it is both personal and cosmic. Personal because the Lyrans regard humanity as their children, their descendants, their most precious creative legacy in the physical realm, and the desire of any parent to see their child grow into full awareness of their potential and their heritage is as real and as powerful in these ancient beings as it is in any human parent who has watched a child struggle toward understanding. Cosmic, because the remembering that the Lyrans are seeking to catalyze in humanity is not merely the remembering of ancestral history, not merely the intellectual recognition of an extraterrestrial origin. It is the remembering of what consciousness is, of what human beings fundamentally are, of the cosmic significance of the human experiment and the role humanity is designed to play in the ongoing evolution of galactic civilization. What specifically do the Lyrans want humanity to remember? The accounts that bear on this question are remarkably consistent across independent sources, and they point to a cluster of interrelated recognitions that together constitute what might be called the Lyran transmission to humanity. The first and most fundamental is the recognition of unity. The Lyran civilization's deepest wisdom, forged through the fire of the catastrophe that destroyed their home worlds, is the recognition that the experience of separation, the ego's conviction that it is fundamentally alone in a universe of other separate beings, is not the truth of existence, but a creative adventure that consciousness takes in physical form, an exploration of what it is to be apparently individual, apparently finite, apparently separate. This adventure has value. It produces experiences, insights, and forms of wisdom that cannot be produced in any other way, but it is not the final word. And when a civilization takes the experience of separation as the ultimate reality, when it loses the awareness of the underlying unity that holds all the apparently separate pieces together, it becomes capable of the kind of violence, exploitation, and mutual destruction that tore the Lyran homeworlds apart. The remembering of unity that the Lyrans are working to catalyze in humanity is therefore not an abstract spiritual teaching. It is, from their perspective, a matter of survival. Not just the survival of humanity, though that is certainly part of it, the survival of the galactic experiment itself. Because humanity, with its extraordinary combination of genetic inheritance and creative potential, represents a possibility for the emergence of a new form of consciousness in the galaxy, one that has never existed before in quite this configuration, one whose full expression could contribute something irreplaceable to the galactic community. The loss of humanity to the same dynamics of separation and conflict that destroyed the Lyran homeworlds would be a loss not just for humanity, but for the entire galactic family. The second element of the Lyran transmission is the recognition of human potential. The Lyrans are acutely, even painfully aware of the gap between what humanity currently is and what humanity was designed to be. They know, in a way that most humans do not, the extraordinary potentials that are encoded in the human genome and in the human consciousness template, potentials that have been systematically suppressed, limited, and misdirected throughout the recent period of human history. And the urgency they feel about the current human awakening is in part the urgency of parents who can see their child about to walk off a cliff while simultaneously watching the first signs of the understanding that could prevent the fall. The specific potentials they are most concerned with awakening in humanity are those that directly address the dynamics most dangerous to human survival. The capacity for genuine empathy, which undermines the dehumanizing of others that makes violence possible. The capacity for expanded perception, which makes the manipulation of consciousness by hidden agendas increasingly difficult. The capacity for creative collaboration, which offers an alternative to the competitive, extractive economic models that are currently destroying the human relationship with Earth's biosphere. And the capacity for direct spiritual knowing, which provides an alternative foundation for human meaning-making that does not depend on the institutional, religious, and political structures that have been the primary means of social control throughout recorded human history. The third element of the Lyran transmission is what might be called the cosmic context. One of the most significant factors limiting human consciousness in its current state is the profound narrowness of the framework within which most human beings understand their own existence. The conventional modern worldview places humanity in a universe that is vast and largely empty, that came into being randomly, that has no inherent meaning or direction, and in which humanity occupies a privileged position by accident rather than by design. Within this framework, human experience is the whole story, human history is all there is, and the notion that there are other civilizations in the galaxy with whom humanity has a real and consequential relationship is either a fringe belief or a science fiction premise. The Lyrans know that this framework is wrong, not just incomplete, but actively, consequentially wrong in ways that prevent humanity from understanding its own situation accurately, from responding appropriately to the challenges and opportunities of the current moment, and from taking its rightful place in the galactic community. The cosmic context they are working to transmit is the understanding that humanity exists in a galaxy teeming with conscious intelligence, that it has relationships, obligations, and potentials that extend far beyond the boundaries of this solar system, and that the decisions humanity makes in the coming decades will not only determine the future of this planet, but will ripple outward through the galactic community in ways that the Lyrans can already perceive from their expanded temporal perspective. This third element of the Lyran transmission is perhaps the most disorienting for the human mind to absorb. It is one thing to be told that there is life elsewhere in the universe. It is quite another to be told that you have specific, personal, ancestrally encoded relationships with beings in distant star systems, that your DNA carries their history, that your consciousness potentials were designed by a collaborative extraterrestrial consortium, and that your choices in this particular lifetime have galactic significance. Most human beings, encountering this information for the first time, feel simultaneously exhilarated and overwhelmed. The framework is so much larger than the one they have been living within that the psychological adjustment it requires is substantial. The Lyrans understand this. They are patient. They have been working to transmit this information and to catalyze this remembering for thousands of years, and they are prepared to work for as long as it takes. But they are also increasingly urgent in their transmissions, because the current period of Earth's development represents a kind of cosmic inflection point, a moment when the various forces that have been shaping human history, both terrestrial and extraterrestrial, are converging in ways that demand resolution. The outcome of this convergence will determine, in ways that the Lyrans can perceive from their expanded perspective, not just the future of humanity, but the configuration of the galactic community for the next phase of its development, a phase that has been in preparation for a very long time. The Lyran agenda also includes what can only be described as a process of healing. Not just healing for humanity, though that is certainly part of it. Healing for the Lyrans themselves. The destruction of their homeworlds, the trauma of the diaspora, and the guilt that many Lyrans carry about their own role in creating the conditions that made the catastrophe possible. These are wounds that have not fully healed across the millions of years that have passed since the events that inflicted them. The Lyrans are beings of extraordinary consciousness and wisdom, but they are not beyond the need for healing. And the healing they need is precisely the healing that comes from seeing their most cherished creation, the beings they brought into existence with such hope and such love and such care, finally achieve the potential for which they were designed. This is not a selfish motive in any ordinary sense. It is the motive of beings who understand that their own wholeness is genuinely connected to the wholeness of those they have created and those they have harmed. The Lyrans know, from their own bitter experience, that the wound of separation, the belief that one's own well-being is independent of the well-being of others, is the source of all destruction. And they have come to understand that their own healing, their own full return to the unity that is the true nature of consciousness, requires the healing of the entire lineage, including the children they placed on a small blue-green world in an outer arm of the Milky Way galaxy, and then had to watch, from a distance, struggle toward the remembering that everything depends on. This is the full picture of the Lyran agenda, as it emerges from the most careful and comprehensive study of the available sources. It is not the agenda of exploiters or controllers. It is not the agenda of missionaries trying to impose their own understanding on a less developed people. It is the agenda of parents, of ancestors, of elders who carry the scars of a great mistake and the wisdom of a hard-won recovery, working with patience and love and urgency to help their children find the path that the elders themselves found only after great loss. Understanding this agenda changes the entire quality of the human relationship to the extraterrestrial phenomenon. It transforms the potentially alienating and frightening prospect of contact with advanced civilizations into something much more intimate, much more personal, and much more meaningful. The beings who are most deeply invested in humanity's future are not strangers. They are family. Ancient, immensely powerful, enormously wise family, with all the complexity and imperfection that family always involves, but family nonetheless. And family, ultimately, is what the entire Lyran story is about. There is another dimension of the Lyran agenda that must be addressed with equal honesty, because to present only the benevolent and healing aspects of their relationship to humanity would be to engage in exactly the kind of oversimplification that this exploration is intended to avoid. Not all beings who carry Lyran genetics are operating from the service to all orientation of the Lyran mainstream. We have already described the emergence of the separatist faction within the Lyran civilization, the beings who discovered the technology of consciousness suppression and who used it in service of control rather than liberation. These beings and their descendants have not disappeared from the galactic stage. They are still present, and some of them are still engaged with Earth. The history of extraterrestrial involvement with Earth is not a simple story of benevolent progenitors watching over their beloved children. It is a complex, multifactional story in which different groups with very different agendas have been competing for influence over the direction of human development for thousands of years. The Lyran mainstream, operating through their Pleadean, Arcturan, and Syrian descendants, represents the service to all faction that is genuinely working for human awakening and liberation. Other groups, some of which carry Lyran genetics but have departed radically from the Lyran spiritual tradition, are working for very different ends. Understanding the full complexity of this multifactional extraterrestrial engagement with Earth is essential for anyone who wants to navigate the current period of accelerating contact with clarity and discernment. Not everything that presents itself as friendly assistance from advanced beings is what it claims to be. The ability to distinguish genuine service from subtle control, genuine empowerment from sophisticated dependency, is one of the most important capacities that the current moment demands of awakening human beings. And developing that discernment requires exactly the expanded awareness, the direct spiritual knowing, and the felt connection to one's own deepest nature that the Lyran mainstream is working so urgently to support. Hidden mysteries, technologies, and knowledge beyond current human science. Throughout human history, there have been moments when knowledge appeared in civilizations that seemed to come from nowhere, to exceed the apparent developmental stage of the cultures that expressed it, to reflect an understanding of reality that the historical record cannot account for within the standard model of gradual human intellectual development. The pyramids of Egypt, whose engineering still challenges our best modern technology to explain. The astronomical knowledge of the ancient Maya, whose tracking of galactic cycles required a mathematical sophistication that supposedly primitive cultures could not have developed independently. The healing wisdom of the ancient world, reflected in medical texts from Egypt, India, and China that describe surgical procedures, herbal treatments, and energetic healing modalities that were not rediscovered by Western medicine until centuries or millennia later. The sacred geometry encoded in stone monuments from England to Peru, reflecting a mathematical understanding of the relationship between physical form and energetic reality that mainstream science is only beginning to approach. These anomalies of human intellectual history are not simply puzzles for academic specialists. They are clues, left in stone and text and astronomical alignment, to the existence of a much older and much deeper body of knowledge than the standard model of human development acknowledges. They are fragments of a tradition of understanding, deliberately preserved and encoded in forms robust enough to survive thousands of years of cultural upheaval and deliberate suppression, whose source is the extraterrestrial civilizations that seeded and guided human development from the earliest times. The hidden mysteries encoded in the monuments and texts of the ancient world can be grouped into several major categories, each of which points toward a specific domain of knowledge that the Lyran-derived civilizations possessed and attempted to transmit to humanity. The first and most pervasive category is the mystery of frequency and resonance. The Lyran understanding of reality is fundamentally a frequency-based understanding. Everything that exists, from the most subtle, non-physical dimension of consciousness to the most dense physical matter, is understood as organized patterns of vibration, frequency, resonance. Physical matter is not fundamentally solid. It is organized energy, vibration given such a specific pattern and such a high coherence that it manifests as the apparently solid world we experience through our physical senses. And because reality is fundamentally frequency-based, it can be worked with at the frequency level in ways that appear miraculous from the perspective of a materialist framework, but that are perfectly comprehensible within the Lyran science of consciousness. The ancient world's knowledge of this frequency-based reality is encoded most explicitly in its music, its architecture, and its ritual practice. The specific musical intervals preserved in various ancient traditions, the particular proportional systems used in sacred architecture from the Parthenon to the great cathedrals of medieval Europe, to the temples of ancient Egypt and India, the specific procedures of ancient ritual and ceremony, all reflect a precise understanding of how specific frequencies interact with human consciousness and with the larger field of physical reality in ways that produce specific, reproducible results. The most tangible expression of this knowledge is the phenomenon of acoustic levitation, the use of specific sound frequencies to overcome the apparent constraint of gravity on physical objects. There are traditions from multiple ancient cultures describing the use of sound in the construction of massive stone monuments. Descriptions of stones that were made to float or to move with apparently minimal force, of structures assembled in ways that defy what our current understanding of physics should make possible. These accounts have been dismissed as legend by mainstream scholarship, but researchers working at the intersection of physics and consciousness studies have demonstrated that acoustic levitation is a real phenomenon, that specific sound frequencies can indeed counteract gravity to a degree that modern science can measure and verify. The Lyran science of frequency extends far beyond acoustic levitation, however. It encompasses what might be called frequency medicine, the treatment of physical and energetic illness through the application of specific frequencies to the human body and its energetic field. The ancient healing traditions of Egypt, India, and China all contain elements of this frequency-based medicine. The use of specific tones, specific geometric forms, specific colors of light, and specific mineral and plant substances whose primary therapeutic action is energetic rather than biochemical. The modern development of technologies like bioresonance therapy, pulsed electromagnetic field therapy, and photobiomodulation therapy are reinventions from within the framework of modern materialist science, of approaches that were fully developed in the Lyran tradition thousands of years ago. The second major category of hidden mysteries is the knowledge of consciousness itself, specifically the understanding of the multi-level nature of human consciousness and the techniques for developing and expanding it. The Lyran tradition, as we have described, understood consciousness as the fundamental reality, and the understanding of how that consciousness operates, how it takes physical form, how it evolves across multiple lifetimes, how it can be deliberately developed and expanded, was among the most carefully preserved of all Lyran knowledge. This knowledge was transmitted to humanity through multiple channels, most significantly through the great mystical traditions that appeared in virtually every ancient culture. The Egyptian mystery schools, the Vedic tradition of India, the Taoist tradition of China, the Pythagorean and later the Platonic philosophical schools of the Greek world, the Sufi tradition of Islam, the Kabbalistic tradition within Judaism, the esoteric streams within Christianity, the shamanic traditions of indigenous cultures worldwide. All of these represent different cultural expressions of the same underlying understanding of consciousness and its development. An understanding whose common source is the Lyran tradition transmitted to humanity through successive waves of direct extraterrestrial contact and through the ongoing energetic transmission that has never ceased. The specific techniques these traditions preserve for the development of consciousness, meditation, breathwork, sound practice, movement practice, visualization, dream work, and various forms of focused contemplation are not arbitrary cultural inventions. They are precision instruments for the development of specific capacities of consciousness, developed and refined through millions of years of Lyran experience and encoded into human cultural traditions in forms adapted to the specific cognitive and emotional characteristics of the human beings who would use them. The effectiveness of these techniques, even in their often degraded and fragmented modern forms, is itself evidence of their genuine depth and origin. Meditation, for example, practiced seriously and consistently, produces measurable changes in brain structure and function, in immune system performance, in psychological resilience and emotional regulation, and in the reported experience of practitioners who consistently describe movement toward exactly the kind of expanded, permeable, multi-level consciousness that characterizes the Lyran baseline. These effects are too consistent, too reproducible, and too specifically directed toward particular expansions of human capacity to be the product of random cultural invention. They are the results of a technology designed by experts who knew exactly what they were doing. The third major category of hidden mysteries is the knowledge of what might be called cosmic cartography, the mapping of the galactic structure and the cycles of cosmic time that organize the larger patterns of consciousness evolution in this part of the universe. The Lyran civilization, having developed across multiple star systems over millions of years, accumulated an understanding of the larger patterns of galactic life that goes far beyond anything in current human astronomy. This understanding was encoded in the astronomical and calendrical traditions of the ancient world in ways that researchers are still unpacking. The Mayan calendar, with its extraordinary complexity and its tracking of multiple overlapping cycles of cosmic time, is perhaps the most explicit surviving example of this cosmic cartography in human cultural tradition. The longest of the Mayan cycles, the so-called Great Cycle of approximately 26,000 years, corresponds precisely to the precession of the equinoxes, the wobble of Earth's axis that slowly rotates the direction of the North Pole through all 12 constellations of the zodiac over that period. But the Mayan calendar does not simply track this cycle. It encodes within its structure an interpretation of what the cycle means, specifically the idea that the precessional cycle marks out periods of greater or lesser connection between Earth and what the Maya called the Galactic Center, the region at the heart of the Milky Way galaxy from which they believed cosmic intelligence radiates outward. As Earth's precessional position changes, the relationship between the planet and the larger galactic energy field changes, producing cycles of spiritual awakening and spiritual dormancy, cycles of greater or lesser human access to the cosmic consciousness that is the natural inheritance of the human template. The current period, the period we are now living through in the early 21st century, marks the beginning of a new great cycle. A transition point from a period of relative cosmic dormancy into a period of intensifying cosmic connection. The Mayan calendar identifies this transition with specific astronomical alignments involving the galactic center and the position of the winter solstice sun, alignments that achieved their closest approximation in the period centered around December 21, 2012. The significance of this date has been both overinterpreted in popular culture, treated as a predicted apocalyptic event, and underestimated by mainstream academia, dismissed as primitive superstition. The more nuanced understanding, which corresponds to what the Lyran-derived sources have communicated to modern contactees, is that 2012 marked not an ending, but a beginning. The opening of a window of cosmic alignment that will continue to intensify over the next several centuries, a window during which the connection between Earth and the larger galactic consciousness field is becoming progressively stronger, and through which the kind of consciousness transformation that the Lyrans have been working toward in humanity is becoming increasingly possible. The fourth category of hidden mysteries is perhaps the most practically significant for the current moment. The knowledge of free energy technology, or what researchers in this field prefer to call zero-point energy technology. The extraction of useful energy from the quantum vacuum, the sea of energy that underlies all physical reality and from which all physical forms emerge. The Lyran civilization, in its mature phase, had long since moved beyond the use of fuel-based energy systems. Their technology drew its power directly from the vacuum field that permeates all of space, a source of energy that is effectively inexhaustible, perfectly clean, and available everywhere in the universe without any need for fuel extraction, combustion, or waste disposal. This technology, or at least the theoretical framework that points toward it, has been discovered repeatedly by human inventors in the modern era, from Nikola Tesla's late work on radiant energy and the transmission of power through the Earth, to the work of John Hutchison, Tom Bearden, Eugene Malov, and many others who have contributed to what is broadly called the free energy research community. In every case, these developments have been suppressed. The suppression has not been the accidental result of scientific conservatism or funding limitations. It has been deliberate, systematic, and in some cases violent, the deliberate elimination of technologies that would fundamentally disrupt the economic and power structures currently organized around the scarcity and control of energy. The suppression of free energy technology is perhaps the clearest single example of the way in which the hidden agendas of control-oriented groups, human and extraterrestrial alike, have prevented humanity from accessing the fruits of its own legitimate scientific development. The Lyran tradition holds that the liberation of this technology, the genuine and full development and deployment of zero-point energy systems, is one of the most important steps in humanity's transition to the next phase of its development. Not simply because it would solve the practical problems of energy poverty and environmental destruction, though it would certainly do both, but because the existence of free, abundant, clean energy would fundamentally change the social and political dynamics that currently organize human civilization around scarcity, competition, and the control of resources. A civilization with access to unlimited free energy is a civilization in which the material basis for exploitation and domination has been largely removed, in which the creative energy currently expended on resource competition can be redirected toward genuinely creative and collaborative ends. The fifth category of hidden mysteries is the knowledge of what might be called biological alchemy, the deliberate transformation of the physical body through specific practices and technologies to bring it into closer alignment with its full Lyran template. The human body, as currently expressed, is significantly below the full potential of the humanoid template it represents. The Lyran genome that contributed to human DNA carries encodings for biological capabilities that are largely dormant in the current human expression. Capacities for greater longevity, for heightened sensory acuity, for bioluminescence, for the regeneration of damaged tissue, for the conscious regulation of physiological processes that are currently automatic and unconscious. The activation of these dormant capacities is the subject of much of the most esoteric material in the ancient wisdom traditions, described in various cultural frameworks as the development of the light body, the activation of the Merkaba, the attainment of the rainbow body, or the achievement of physical immortality. These descriptions, while varying in their cultural clothing, are consistently pointing toward the same biological process, the deliberate, practice-driven activation of dormant genetic encodings that transform the human body into a more fully realized expression of its Lyran template. The practices most directly associated with this process across all the traditions that preserve it share certain common features: extended periods of specific breathing practices, prolonged meditative absorption, specific dietary practices, the deliberate cultivation of certain emotional and energetic states, and the use of specific sound frequencies and geometric visualizations. Modern researchers working in areas like epigenetics, the study of how environmental and experiential factors can turn genes on and off, are beginning to develop the scientific framework that could eventually explain these ancient practices in terms comprehensible to the current scientific paradigm. The hidden mysteries of the Lyran tradition are not, ultimately, secrets kept from humanity out of any desire to maintain superiority or mystery for its own sake. They are knowledge that has been carefully preserved in the most robust and redundant forms available, against the day when humanity would be ready to receive it in its full form, when the level of consciousness development achieved by at least a critical portion of humanity would allow these deep truths to be understood, integrated, and applied with the wisdom that their power demands. That day, according to multiple Lyran-derived sources, is now approaching. The current period of human awakening, which is being felt and reported by millions of people across all cultures and all demographics, represents the beginning of exactly the readiness that the Lyrans have been patiently waiting for. The acceleration of human consciousness development that has been underway since the middle of the 20th century is not accidental. It is the result of the convergence of the cosmic window described in the Mayan calendar with the deliberate intensification of the Lyran energetic transmission to humanity, a transmission that has been building in strength and specificity as the cosmic alignment has progressed. The hidden mysteries are becoming less hidden, not because anyone is deciding to reveal them, but because the consciousness that is required to receive them is increasingly present in humanity itself. The Lyran secrets are not secrets that can be stolen or betrayed. They are understanding that can only be received when the receiver is ready, when the field of awareness has expanded sufficiently to hold the signal without distortion. The expansion of that field in humanity, the readying of the receiver, is what the entire Lyran agenda has been working toward, and what the current extraordinary moment in human history represents. Lyrans in the modern era, contactees, encounters, and evidence. The 20th century represents, in the history of the Lyran-human relationship, a moment of dramatic acceleration. After thousands of years of maintaining their contact with humanity primarily through the subtle channels of dream, inspiration, and indirect energetic transmission, the Lyran-derived civilizations, along with the broader galactic community they belong to, made a decision to intensify and make more explicit their presence in human awareness. This decision was not arbitrary. It was a response to a specific inflection point in human history, the development and use of nuclear weapons. The detonation of the first atomic bombs in 1945 represented, from the perspective of the galactic community, a threshold event of the highest significance. Not simply because of the catastrophic destruction those weapons caused to the human beings and ecosystems in their immediate path, as devastating as that was, but because the development of nuclear technology by a civilization that had not yet achieved the consciousness development necessary to use such power wisely represented an existential risk that the galactic community could not ignore. A species that had reached the level of destructive power, represented by nuclear weapons, without the corresponding development of emotional intelligence, ethical maturity, and cooperative social organization, was a species capable of destroying not just itself, but potentially its entire solar system and the life it supported. This is the context within which the explosion of UFO sightings, contact experiences, and extraterrestrial communications that began in earnest in the late 1940s needs to be understood. The arrival of large numbers of craft from multiple extraterrestrial civilizations in Earth's skies beginning in 1947 was not a coincidence. It was a response by beings who had seen, in the history of their own civilization and in the broader history of the galactic community, exactly what happens when technological development outpaces spiritual development, and who were not willing to watch the cycle repeat itself on a world they regarded as their children's home. The specific role of the Lyrans and their Pleadean descendants in the modern contact era is somewhat more subtle than the dramatic aerial displays provided by some of the other extraterrestrial civilizations present in Earth's skies during this period. The Lyrans themselves rarely appear in what might be called spectacular physical manifestations. Their approach has been more intimate and more targeted, working with specific individuals whose consciousness development and psychological profile makes them capable of receiving and transmitting the specific kinds of information the Lyrans most need to communicate. The pattern of Lyran-influenced contact experiences has several distinguishing characteristics that researchers have identified across multiple independent cases. The first is the quality of the beings encountered. They are consistently described as tall, luminous, golden or white-haired, with large eyes of extraordinary depth and expressiveness, and with a quality of presence that is simultaneously overwhelming and deeply reassuring. These are the Nordic or Lyran-type beings that have been reported in contact accounts from the 1950s to the present day, distinguishable from the taller, more angular Pleiadian type primarily by a certain quality of timelessness in their presence, a sense that they are not simply from another planet, but from another order of time entirely. The second distinguishing characteristic is the content of the communications. Lyran contact experiences consistently convey information about cosmic history, about the Lyran origin of humanity, about the current galactic situation and its significance for Earth, and about the specific practices and understandings that humanity needs to develop to navigate its current crisis successfully. These communications are not vague spiritual platitudes. They are specific, detailed, internally consistent, and frequently verifiable in their factual elements against other independent sources, both human and extraterrestrial. George Adamski, whose contact claims in the 1950s were among the first and remain among the most controversial in the UFO research community, described encounters with beings who were strikingly consistent with the Lyran Nordic type. Tall, fair-haired, luminous, with large, deep eyes, and an air of enormous calm authority. His accounts of their communications emphasize the cosmic significance of Earth's current moment, the dangers of nuclear development, and the existence of a vast galactic community of which humanity was as yet only a peripheral and largely unconscious member. While Adamski's claims have been disputed and his credibility attacked by both UFO researchers and mainstream scientists, the phenomenological content of his descriptions, separated from the questions of his personal reliability, is consistent with the broader body of Lyran contact material in ways that are difficult to dismiss as simple fabrication. George Van Tassel, the California desert contactee who ran the Giant Rock Spacecraft Convention for many years and who claimed ongoing communication with extraterrestrial beings through a form of mental transmission, received information about galactic history and the nature of consciousness that anticipated many of the themes that would later emerge in the more extensively documented Lyran contact material. His accounts of beings who described themselves as representing civilizations of tremendous antiquity, civilizations that had seeded life throughout the galaxy and that regarded humanity as their collective responsibility, are clearly in the same stream of information as the Meyer material, the Collier material, and the various channeled sources that followed. Billy Meyer's contact experience, beginning in the 1970s and continuing for decades, represents perhaps the most extensively documented case of what appears to be genuine Pleadean, and by extension, Lyran contact in the modern era. Meyer's photographs, films, and metal samples were subjected to rigorous technical analysis by multiple independent researchers and laboratories, with results that consistently exceeded what could be explained by known techniques of fabrication available at the time. The information provided by his contacts, particularly the Pleiadian woman known as Semjase, about galactic history, cosmic law, the history of Earth's extraterrestrial involvement, and the challenges facing humanity in its current developmental phase, is detailed, sophisticated, and internally consistent in ways that are extraordinarily difficult to account for if the contact was not genuine. The specific information about the Lyran origin of the Pleiadians, provided to Meyer by his contacts with a specificity and detail that matches what was subsequently provided through completely independent channels, is particularly significant. Semjase described the exodus of Lyran refugees to the Pleiades in terms that were consistent with what Alex Collier's Andromedan sources would later provide, and with what Lysa Royal's channeling of Lyran entities would later detail, without any obvious means by which Meyer could have had access to those other sources, or by which those sources could have been influenced by Meyer. The convergence of independent accounts around a specific and detailed narrative of Lyran origin is one of the strongest arguments for the genuine extraterrestrial nature of at least some of these contacts. Alex Collier's contact experience, which began in the late 1980s and has been extensively documented through his public presentations and written material, provides what many researchers consider the most comprehensive single-source account of the galactic history and context within which the Lyran story takes place. Collier's contacts, beings from the Andromeda Galaxy, whom he identified as Morane and Visayas, provided him with detailed information about the Lyran origin of humanoid life in this galaxy, the Lyran Wars, the subsequent seeding of multiple star systems with humanoid life, the development of the various civilizations in the galactic community, and the specific situation of Earth within that community. What is particularly significant about Collier's material, beyond its internal coherence and its consistency with other independent sources, is its unflinching engagement with the full complexity of the galactic situation, including the less comfortable elements. Collier did not receive and did not transmit a simple narrative of benevolent space brothers coming to save humanity. He received a nuanced, sometimes disturbing account of a complex, multifactional reality in which genuinely service-oriented civilizations coexisted with service-to-self-oriented civilizations in a dynamic that had significant implications for Earth. His willingness to engage with this complexity, to refuse to offer simple reassurances about the nature of extraterrestrial involvement with humanity, is itself a marker of the genuine quality of his material. Lysa Royal's contribution to the modern understanding of Lyran contact represents a different but equally significant channel. Royal, working as a channel for what she identified as Lyran and Syrian entities in collaboration with researcher Keith Priest, produced a body of material specifically focused on galactic history and the Lyran lineage that is unique in its systematic and organized quality. Unlike some channeled material, which tends toward vague spiritual generalities, Royal's Lyran material engaged in specific historical and cosmological detail, describing the Lyran homeworlds, the internal conflicts within Lyran civilization, the diaspora and its various branches, and the specific mechanisms of human genetic development, with a precision that has struck many researchers as inconsistent with fabrication. Barbara Marciniak's Pleadean material, channeled over several decades and published in a series of books beginning with Bringers of the Dawn in 1992, represents another significant channel through which Lyran-derived information has flowed into modern human consciousness. The Pleadean entities Marciniak channels speak explicitly about their Lyran origins and about the Lyran role in the design and development of humanity. They describe the current period of Earth's development with an urgency and a specificity that has struck many readers as prophetic in the most pragmatic rather than the most mystical sense, pointing to specific social, political, and consciousness dynamics that have played out in the years since their communications in ways that validate their described perspective. What is notable about all of these major contact cases, beyond the specific content they provide, is the common pattern of their impact on the contactees themselves. Without exception, serious contact with what appear to be Lyran or Pleadean beings produces in the contactee a fundamental reorganization of their understanding of reality, a deep personal transformation that goes far beyond intellectual belief change. The contactees describe a quality of knowing, an absolute certainty rooted not in logical argument, but in direct experience, that the contact was real, that the beings encountered were real, and that the information received was true at a level they had not previously had access to. They describe a profound, often permanent expansion of their perceptual capacity, increased intuitive knowing, heightened sensitivity to the emotional states of others, greater clarity about the nature of consciousness and the purpose of physical existence. And they describe an intensified sense of mission, a felt urgency about contributing to the awakening of human consciousness in whatever way they are individually positioned to do. This last element, the activation of mission in contactees, is itself significant. It suggests that the contact experiences are not simply information delivery events, but consciousness activation events, experiences designed to catalyze specific developments in the consciousness of the contactees that will then ripple outward through their interactions with other human beings. The Lyran agenda, in other words, operates not just through the information that contactees receive and transmit, but through the consciousness transformation that the contact experience itself produces in them, a transformation that makes them more effective transmitters of the frequency of expanded awareness that the Lyrans are working to seed throughout the human population. The modern era has also produced a different kind of evidence for the Lyran connection to humanity, one that comes not from contact experiences, but from the accelerating study of genetics and DNA. The discovery, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, of the extraordinary complexity and the apparent non-random organization of the human genome has raised questions that the standard evolutionary framework cannot fully answer. The percentage of human DNA that codes for proteins, the conventional definition of functional genetic material, is remarkably small compared to the total genome. The vast majority of human DNA was initially dismissed as junk, evolutionary debris with no meaningful function. More recent research has systematically dismantled this dismissal, revealing that much of this so-called junk DNA plays crucial regulatory and organizational roles in the function of the genome as a whole. But there remain elements of the human genome that are not fully accounted for by any purely terrestrial evolutionary process. The apparent sudden appearance of fully modern human cognitive capacity in the fossil record, without the gradual developmental sequence that evolutionary theory predicts for such a complex development, has been a persistent puzzle for paleoanthropologists. the specific genetic changes that distinguish Homo sapiens from our closest evolutionary relatives, particularly in the areas of brain development, language capacity, and the regulation of emotional and social behavior, show a pattern of change that some researchers consider inconsistent with the pace of natural selection alone. Within the framework we have been exploring, these anomalies in the human genetic record are exactly what we would expect to find if the human genome had been supplemented and modified by extraterrestrial genetic intervention at specific points in the evolutionary timeline. They are the fingerprints of the Lyran contribution to the human template, visible in the structure of the genome itself for anyone who knows what to look for and who is willing to consider the evidence without the filter of materialist assumption. There is also a body of evidence coming from the accounts of people who have had what researchers call starseed experiences, moments of direct recognition outside of any contact event of their own extraterrestrial origin. Millions of people across the world report a felt sense of not quite belonging in the human world as currently constituted, a longing for a form of community and consciousness that they have never found in their earthly experience, but that feels more like home than home does. A recognition often triggered by looking at the night sky that their true origin is elsewhere. The consistency of these experiences across cultures, ages, and demographics, and the specific characteristics of the star systems with which people identify, particularly the Pleiades and Lyra, is itself a significant data point in the assessment of the Lyran story's reality. The Lyran bloodlines, ancient lineages, and encoded consciousness. One of the most controversial and most significant claims in the Lyran research literature is the assertion that certain human bloodlines carry a higher concentration of Lyran or Pleiadian genetic material than the general human population, and that this higher concentration produces specific and measurable differences in the consciousness, perceptual capacity, and spiritual potential of the individuals who carry it. This claim, examined carefully and honestly, reveals dimensions of human history that are simultaneously more extraordinary and more sobering than the conventional historical narrative acknowledges. Let us begin with the biological dimension of this claim. The human genome, as we have established, carries contributions from multiple extraterrestrial sources. With the Lyran contribution at the foundational level, this does not mean that every human being carries identical amounts of this genetic contribution. The history of human migration, selective breeding, and the various specific interventions by extraterrestrial civilizations at different points in human history has produced a population in which the distribution of the various extraterrestrial genetic contributions is highly variable. Some lineages, particularly those that maintained geographic and social isolation over long periods, and that were specifically targeted for genetic enhancement by extraterrestrial groups with particular agendas, carry concentrations of specific genetic markers that are significantly higher than the population average. The lineages most frequently identified in this context are those that formed the ruling classes of the first great human civilizations: the pharaonic lineages of ancient Egypt, the Sumerian and Akkadian royal lines of ancient Mesopotamia, the Vedic Brahmin and Kshatriya lineages of ancient India, the imperial lines of ancient China, and certain lineages of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. In each case, these groups claimed, within their own cultural framework, a special relationship to the sky beings or gods, a descent from divine or semi-divine ancestors, and a resulting special authority in the social and spiritual organization of their communities. The historical dismissal of these claims as self-serving propaganda by elites seeking to justify their privileged position is understandable within the framework of conventional historical analysis. But within the framework we are exploring, the claims have a different and more literal significance. The ancient ruling lineages were not simply inventing a divine ancestry to legitimate their power. They were, in many cases, accurately remembering an actual genealogy, a descent from beings of genuinely extraterrestrial origin who had directly contributed to their biological line. This does not mean that descent from extraterrestrial lineages is a reliable indicator of wisdom or spiritual attainment in any individual case. The Lyran story has already provided ample evidence that genetic inheritance, however distinguished, is not a substitute for the development of consciousness through personal experience and genuine moral growth. The fallen Lyrans, the most destructive figures in the Lyran story, were of impeccable genetic lineage by any measure. What differentiated them from their wiser counterparts was not their genetics, but their choices, the direction in which they applied the extraordinary capabilities their lineage gave them. The human lineages that carry significant extraterrestrial genetic contributions are therefore neither automatically superior nor automatically suspect. They are simply lineages in which specific genetic potentials are more highly expressed. Lineages that, depending on the choices and the consciousness development of their individual members, can produce either exceptional wisdom and exceptional service to the evolution of collective consciousness, or exceptional capacity for the manipulation and control of others. The same genetic potential that produces a genuine mystic or a great healer can, in a consciousness that has not developed the ethical depth to handle it responsibly, produce a highly sophisticated manipulator. This duality is essential to understand because it explains something that has puzzled many students of both history and extraterrestrial research. Why have the lineages identified as carrying the highest concentrations of extraterrestrial genetic material so often been associated with both extraordinary cultural achievement and extraordinary abuse of power? The ancient Egyptian pharaonic lineage produced, in its greatest expressions, a civilization of stunning beauty and spiritual depth, and in its most degraded expressions, a system of social organization built on the exploitation of a vast slave population. The same pattern repeats in the great civilizations of Mesopotamia, India, China, and Mesoamerica. Extraordinary cultural achievement alongside extraordinarily brutal social hierarchy. This pattern is the human version of the fundamental Lyran conflict, the tension between the service to all orientation that represents the highest expression of the humanoid template and the service to self orientation that represents its most dangerous shadow. The lineages that most fully express the Lyran contribution carried both potentials in their heightened form. The history of human civilization, seen through this lens, is the history of that tension playing out over thousands of years, in culture after culture and generation after generation, with neither the shadow fully triumphant nor the light fully realized. But there is a more hopeful dimension to this story, one that is particularly relevant to the current moment. The concentration of Lyran and Pleadean genetic material in specific lineages is not limited to the aristocratic and royal lineages of the ancient world. The various waves of extraterrestrial genetic intervention in human history were not restricted to the ruling classes, though those interventions are the most historically documented because the ruling classes were the ones whose histories were preserved. There were also quieter, less historically visible interventions directed at other segments of the human population, interventions designed to seed the genetic potential for expanded consciousness more broadly through the general population. The result, accumulated over thousands of years of human migration, interbreeding, and cultural exchange, is that the descendants of these quieter interventions are now distributed widely throughout the human population, often in individuals with no particular connection to the historically prominent lineages. The so-called starseeds, the people who carry a particularly strong resonance with extraterrestrial consciousness and a particularly strong drive toward the expansion of human awareness, are not limited to the descendants of ancient royal lineages. They are found in every demographic, every culture, every economic stratum of contemporary humanity. What identifies them is not their ancestry, which is often unknown to them, but their experience. The felt sense of cosmic origin, the extraordinary sensitivity to the emotional and energetic states of others, the intense drive toward meaning and spiritual understanding, the difficulty fitting comfortably into conventional social structures and value systems, and the recurring quality of what might be called cosmic homesickness, the longing for a form of community and connection that the ordinary human world rarely provides. These individuals, the starseeds, the indigo children, the crystal children, the various names by which different researchers have identified this population in the modern literature, are not a separate species. They are human beings in whom specific genetic potentials are more highly activated than in the general population, potentials that were deliberately seeded into the human genetic pool over thousands of years specifically for this moment in human history when those potentials would be most urgently needed. The activation of these potentials in increasing numbers of human beings over the past several decades is not accidental. It is the consequence of the cosmic alignment described by the Mayan calendar, the intensification of the energetic field within which Earth exists as the precessional cycle moves toward a new phase. As this field intensifies, it acts as an activator of dormant genetic potential, a cosmic signal that turns on genetic switches that have been waiting, engineered, and patient for exactly this frequency to arrive. The result is the accelerating wave of awakening that researchers of human consciousness are documenting across all cultures and demographics, the emergence of millions of individuals whose perceptual, empathic, and spiritual capacities significantly exceed what the standard model of human development would predict. The Lyran bloodlines, in their ancient expression, were the most concentrated and the most visible expressions of the Lyran contribution to humanity. In their modern expression, distributed widely through the human population and activated by the cosmic alignment of the current era, they represent something different. The emergence of the critical mass of awakened consciousness that the Lyrans have been working toward in humanity since the beginning of the relationship. Not a special elite defined by genetic lineage, not a new ruling class claiming cosmic authority, but a community of ordinary human beings distributed across every culture and every walk of life, who are remembering what they are and beginning to offer that remembering to the collective human awareness. This is the fulfillment of the Lyran intention, not a dramatic arrival of physical beings from the stars, though such contact is also part of what is unfolding, but a far deeper and more lasting transformation, the activation of the Lyran potential within humanity itself, the turning on of the lights from the inside, the discovery by human beings of their own cosmic nature through the development of their own expanded consciousness. The future, what the Lyrans foretell. We have arrived at the final section of this exploration, and appropriately, it is the section that is most directly relevant to the world each of us inhabits right now. Everything we have examined in the preceding sections, the ancient origins of the Lyran civilization, their physical and spiritual characteristics, the height of their culture, the catastrophe that destroyed it, the diaspora that followed, the long history of their involvement with Earth, the nature of their agenda, the hidden mysteries they have preserved and gradually transmitted, the evidence of their engagement in the modern era, and the genetics of their contribution to the human line. All of this is prelude to the question that presses most urgently upon the present moment. What do the Lyrans say is coming? What do they see from their expanded temporal perspective for the future of humanity and of this world? Before engaging with the content of their foresight, it is worth pausing on the question of how beings like the Lyrans can even have access to information about the future. This is a point of genuine puzzlement for many people approaching this material for the first time, accustomed to a framework in which the future is radically uncertain, in which cause and effect unfold in a strictly sequential, linear fashion, and in which no being, however advanced, could know in advance what has not yet occurred. But the Lyran understanding of time, like their understanding of consciousness, is fundamentally different from the conventional human understanding. In the Lyran framework, which is shared by all of the more advanced extraterrestrial civilizations in the galactic community, time is not a linear river flowing in a single direction from past to present to future. Time is a field, a dimension of experience with a complex topology in which what we experience as past, present, and future are all simultaneously present as potentials within the larger field. Access to this larger temporal field is a natural consequence of the expanded, multi-level consciousness that characterizes advanced beings. Much as a person at the top of a mountain has access to a view of the surrounding terrain that is unavailable to someone standing in the valley below. This does not mean that the future is fixed or predetermined. The Lyran understanding is explicit that consciousness is the creative principle, that the choices of conscious beings genuinely shape the unfolding of events, and that multiple futures are always possible at any given moment. What beings with access to the temporal field can perceive is not a single fixed future, but a range of probable futures, organized by the probabilities of various choices and events. They can see which futures are most probable given current trajectories. They can see the choice points, the moments of of genuine creative freedom in which a shift in direction is possible, and they can see, with a clarity unavailable to beings embedded in the linear flow of sequential time, the long-range consequences of choices that from the inside feel small and individual. What the Lyrans and their Pleadean descendants have communicated to human contacts about the probable future of Earth is neither uniformly optimistic nor uniformly frightening. It is complex, conditional, and ultimately placed in the hands of humanity itself in a way that respects human free will, absolutely. They do not say that doom is certain. They do not say that salvation is guaranteed. What they say is that the current moment is one of unprecedented opportunity and unprecedented danger, and that the outcome depends in a very real way on the choices that humanity collectively makes in the near term. The opportunity they describe is nothing less than the completion of the great design that led to the creation of humanity in the first place, the full awakening of human consciousness to its own cosmic nature and potential, the emergence of humanity as a recognized and contributing member of the galactic community, bringing to that community the unique combination of emotional depth, creative intensity, spiritual diversity, and physical vitality that characterizes the human profile at its best. The healing of the ancient wound of separation, not just in humanity but in the galactic community as a whole, through the demonstration that consciousness can travel from the deepest ignorance to the fullest remembering and emerge enriched and enlivened by the journey. The danger they describe is equally real and equally significant. The same technological trajectory that is enabling the accelerating awakening of human consciousness is also enabling the development of weapons and systems of control whose destructive potential exceeds anything that has existed on Earth since the nuclear threshold was crossed in 1945. The same social polarization that is being produced by the clash between awakening consciousness and entrenched systems of control is generating political dynamics that, if they reach certain critical thresholds, could produce cascades of violence, resource conflict, and institutional collapse of a scale that would set back human development by generations. And the same ecological systems that support all life on Earth are under pressures that, without dramatic and rapid change in human behavior and economic organization, will produce cascading failures that could threaten the viability of the biosphere itself. The Lyrans see all of these dangers clearly. They know, better than any human commentator, exactly what it looks like when a civilization approaches the threshold of self-destruction, because they watched it happen to their own civilization. They know the warning signs, they know the decision points, and they know, with a certainty born of direct experience, that the difference between the civilization that destroys itself and the civilization that transforms itself is sometimes measured in very small things. A moment of genuine empathy between adversaries, a decision by a critical number of individuals to prioritize truth over comfort, the activation of a quality of collective consciousness that can hold the full complexity of a difficult situation without collapsing into either denial or despair. The specific future scenarios that Lyran and Pleadean sources have described most consistently in their communications with human contacts involve a period of significant disruption, what various sources call the Great Transition or the Shift, during which the old structures of human civilization that are incompatible with the full expression of human potential will be progressively dismantled, sometimes dramatically, and sometimes through the quieter, less visible processes of cultural and economic transformation. This period of dismantling is not, in the Lyran understanding, primarily a destruction. It is a preparation, the clearing of the ground that must precede the building of something new. The new that they describe is a civilization organized around principles that directly reflect the Lyran tradition at its best, a social organization based on genuine consensus rather than hierarchical authority, an economy based on contribution and abundance rather than extraction and scarcity, a relationship to technology grounded in the understanding that tools are servants of consciousness rather than ends in themselves, a relationship to the natural world grounded in the recognition of its consciousness and its sacredness, and a spiritual culture grounded in the direct knowing of each individual's connection to the larger field of awareness, rather than in doctrines and institutions that mediate and control access to spiritual experience. They describe a world in which what is currently called the disclosure of extraterrestrial reality will have become so complete and so undeniable that the adjustment of human self-understanding to the galactic context will be in full process. Not the sudden, dramatic, socially destabilizing disclosure that certain researchers have been warning about for decades, in which governments simultaneously reveal everything they know about extraterrestrial presence and technology in a way that shocks the social fabric to its foundations. But a more gradual, layered, and ultimately more deeply transformative process of disclosure that works at multiple levels simultaneously: physical, through the increasing visibility and communication of extraterrestrial craft and beings; cultural, through the progressive penetration of galactic awareness into human art, science, philosophy, and spiritual seeking; and biological, through the activation of dormant genetic and consciousness potentials that are making more and more human beings capable of direct access to the broader reality that disclosure is describing. The Lyrans describe the emergence of what they call a new human, not a genetically engineered super being created in a laboratory, but the full expression of the human template as it was originally designed: emotionally rich, spiritually connected, intellectually sophisticated, creatively explosive, physically vibrant, empathically aware, and genuinely capable of the kind of collaborative, non-hierarchical social organization that the galactic community requires of its mature members. This new human is not a replacement for existing human beings. It is the full realization of what existing human beings already are in potential, the flower of the seed that was planted in the human genome by the collaborative effort of the galactic community at the beginning of this civilization. The timeline for this transition is not given with precision in the communications we have examined. The Lyran sources are consistent in their refusal to provide specific dates, partly because the exact timing is genuinely uncertain, dependent on the choices that are made in the near term by humanity itself, and partly because they understand from hard experience the distortion that can be introduced into human perception and behavior by the provision of specific prophecies about particular future events. What they consistently offer instead is a directional understanding that the trajectory of consciousness development now underway in humanity is pointed toward the transformation they describe, that the cosmic conditions for that transformation are fully established and intensifying, and that the primary variable determining how quickly and how smoothly the transformation proceeds is the degree to which individual human beings choose to actively participate in their own awakening rather than waiting passively for external events to force it. This emphasis on individual choice and individual responsibility is itself a profoundly Lyran teaching. The Lyran civilization learned, through the catastrophe that destroyed it, that no collective transformation is more advanced than the individual consciousness development of its members. A civilization in which the wisest and most developed individuals carry the full weight of collective wisdom, while the average member remains in a relative state of unconsciousness, is a civilization vulnerable to exactly the kinds of dynamics that destroyed the Lyran homeworlds. The health of a collective is determined not by its most brilliant members, but by the average level of consciousness throughout the entire group. This is why the Lyran agenda with humanity is not directed primarily at the most gifted, the most spiritually advanced, or the most intellectually sophisticated human beings, though it certainly engages with those individuals. It is directed at the broadest possible base of humanity, working to raise the average level of consciousness throughout the species rather than simply developing a conscious elite. The transmission of Lyran wisdom to human beings through every available channel, from direct contact with specific individuals to the subtle energetic transmissions that flow through the cosmic alignment, from the activation of dormant genetics in starseed individuals to the penetration of galactic awareness through every dimension of human culture, is designed to reach as many people as possible, to lift the floor of human consciousness rather than simply to raise the ceiling. The Lyrans also describe in their communications with human contacts a specific process of reunion that is underway between humanity and the various civilizations of the galactic community. This process began invisibly and will become progressively more visible as humanity's consciousness development reaches the thresholds that make wider contact possible. The initial stages of this reunion, which are arguably already underway, involve the recognition by increasing numbers of human beings of their extraterrestrial connections, the activation of their cosmic memory, and the development of the perceptual and relational capacities necessary for genuine communication with beings whose consciousness operates at different frequencies than current human baseline. The later stages of this reunion, which the Lyrans project into the future beyond the near-term transition period, involve something that the human mind can barely conceptualize from its current perspective: the full integration of humanity into the galactic community, the recognition of human civilization as a sovereign, mature, contributing member of the Confederation of Worlds, and the beginning of a chapter in human history that will make everything in the historical record look like prologue. A chapter in which the full potential of the human template, the extraordinary combination of capacities that were deliberately designed into it by the collaboration of galactic wisdom, is finally expressed without suppression, without limitation, without the weight of a history of trauma and control. The Lyrans carry a particular quality of hope about this future that is not naive optimism but earned conviction. They have seen civilizations transform themselves out of conditions as dire as anything humanity currently faces. They have watched the impossible become inevitable. They know from their own hard-won experience that consciousness is always more powerful than the structures it has created, that the human spirit, even in its most suppressed and confused condition, carries an irreducible drive toward its own liberation that no system of control, however sophisticated, can permanently contain. And they know that the particular combination of qualities that make humanity so challenging also make humanity, at its fullest expression, one of the most extraordinary contributors to the galactic experiment in consciousness that has ever been produced. They have not waited this long and watched this carefully and worked this patiently because they think the outcome is in doubt. They have done all of this because they know, with the certainty of beings who have seen more of time than we can imagine, that the seed they planted in this world is germinating, that the flower of human consciousness, however long delayed by the frost of suppression and ignorance, is preparing to bloom, and that when it does, its beauty will enrich the entire garden of cosmic awareness in ways that none of the gardeners, however wise, have yet fully imagined. This is the message the Lyrans are sending. This is what they have been trying to say across thousands of years of indirect transmission and decades of increasingly direct contact. Not that humanity is doomed, not that salvation comes from outside, but that the liberation of humanity is written in its own nature, encoded in its own DNA, powered by its own irreducible drive toward the fullness of what it is, and that the Lyrans, their ancient ancestors, their cosmic parents, the survivors of a catastrophe greater than anything in human experience, are watching and waiting and working from every dimension available to them to help that liberation find its way into the world. The only question that remains, the only question that has ever really mattered, is the question that the Lyrans themselves faced at the most critical moments of their own history. What will we choose? When the weight of the old world presses hardest and the shape of the new is still uncertain, when the temptation to surrender to fear or to defer to authority or to wait for someone else to lead is at its greatest, what will we choose? The Lyrans chose, eventually, wisdom. After immense suffering and immense error and immense loss, they chose to become beings capable of the depth of consciousness their potential had always promised. They chose the harder path and found, at the end of it, a beauty and a freedom they had not previously imagined. The same choice is before humanity now, and the Lyrans, speaking from across the light years and the millennia, are saying only what every wise elder has always said to the young who stand at the threshold of their own transformation. You are capable of this. You were made for this moment. We are with you. And the love we carry for you is older than the stars you see in the night sky, and will outlast every shadow that has made you doubt your own light. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.